My primary profession now is the publisher of the World Affairs Brief, a weekly news analysis service at www.worldaffairsbrief.com. And my background really is, I've been in the military. I was a Marine Corps officer and fighter pilot during the Vietnam period. Got out of the military because it wasn't, really didn't want moral principled people in it, or people who wanted to improve things. They wanted people who will be yes men and simply do the same thing that has always been done. And any of you who are in the military will understand what I'm saying. You know, a lot of people have spouted rumors about a coup against Obama with high-ranking military generals. And, you know, from my experience, there aren't any generals or any field-grade officers that aren't yes men to the establishment. They are very, very careful about culling out people to make sure that you don't get to higher ranks unless you're a yes man. And so no matter what Mr. Trump says about General Mattis and General Petraeus and others, you just don't, they're not all globalists, by the way. Petraeus is a globalist. He's a person who pushes the North American Union. He's part of a CFR group. Not everyone who's a CFR member is a globalist or is a conspirator. They do bring nominal conservatives in just to muddy the waters so that you can't paint them all with the same brush. But everyone on the Trilateral Commission, for example, is a globalist. So in the Aspen, there's dozens of organizations now, including the Bilderberg Group, the Committee of 300, the Club of Rome. There's just tons of organizations that are globalist, and they do this on purpose to spread out the organizations so that if any of them gets targeted or exposed, they can switch to another, and it becomes very difficult to track what's going on. But the globalists received a fairly major defeat with the election of Donald Trump, and of this we can all applaud. It was just amazing. Usually I agonize when I sit up and watch the election results and turn it off by 10 o'clock at night because the results are predictable. This time they were not predictable. I was watching NPR and switching back and forth between NBC and ABC, and it's amazing to see these people who I've been tracking. I have to watch the mainstream news, not because I learn anything, but I want to see where their slant is, to see where they're distorting the news. It was amazing leading up to the election how confident they were, how cocky they were about this bumbling idiot Donald Trump and making fun of him in every newscast. And of course, he gave him plenty of ammunition. He made lots of mistakes. It didn't seem to matter, though, to people. But as I watched the news coverage, these people were just, well, this is really disturbing here. Donald Trump is ahead. Of course, the big states aren't coming yet, so they were still confident that Hillary Clinton was going to create that landslide they'd all predicted. And then about midnight, it became obvious that, boy, this may not happen. And their faces just started to droop. And, they had to be on camera, and they had to keep talking, and they kept throwing it back and forth. What do you think is happening here? And they started to show this concern. By the 2 o'clock in the morning, where it finally became obvious that Pennsylvania went for Trump and that Michigan was going to go for Trump, they were just downright dejected. And it was amazing to see. My heart leapt with joy, frankly, to see these cocky media people and asking us, how could we have been so wrong? And, it wasn't just that there was media polling that was skewed. The media polls have always been skewed for years. The trouble is, even Trump's polls showed him losing. Now, how was that? How could that? Okay, they're not hearing. Is that better? So even Trump's polls showed him losing. That's why he only hired a hall holding 200 people at a hotel ballroom in New York. And Hillary Clinton had the great big Javits Center glass palace holding thousands of people. And they spent millions of dollars outfitting the stage. And it was just amazing as they would see this empty hall with glum faces at the Javits Center. And everybody was just expecting Hillary to come out and tell them they were going to save the day. And she didn't even show up. So it was a problem for the media, an extreme problem. They started to spin it the next day of how we could have been so wrong. Well, I'll tell you how they were wrong. It has to do with cell phones versus landlines. It's very, very difficult to do polling. Because when everyone had landlines, you would start dial up people and you'd get all this background and databases and put it in a computer, and they would keep dialing the same people. And often that's how you can skew the polls. You know who responded in such a way, and the persons on the telephone think that the names are being drawn randomly by the computer, but they're not random. So they can skew it just by the database that they throw to the phone banks. And they can skew it by the way that they slant the questions. There's many ways to do that. But with the advent of cell phones, it's illegal to do robocalling by cell phones. You can't do computer dialing on cell phones. The law doesn't allow it. And so none of these pollsters can poll cell phones. They've got a shrinking database. How many of you people still have landlines? Look at that, maybe 10%. And how many of you people received a pollster calling you? Well, you do, but they're not robocalls, are they? Well, they're illegal if they're doing. They're not supposed to do robocalls. But the point is, what I'm saying is, they're using a shrinking database. It's a shrinking database. And so what they start doing is skewing the database and say, well, this now represents, instead of 10%, this now represents 80% of the American people. And so it's grossly inaccurate now. And there's no way to fix it because it's too expensive, especially since you have dozens of polling organizations. There used to have been 5 when I was growing up. And now there are hundreds of polling organizations, and the competition is too hard. The reason they got that way is because of robocalling. And now that robocalling doesn't work, because of the shrinking database, they're really stuck. They're having to do a lot of guesswork. And that's why even the Trump campaign didn't have the data. None of them had the data. But we were joyous that at least he won, not because I'm that enthusiastic about Trump. Let me tell you this. No principled constitutional conservative could have won anywhere near the votes of Donald Trump. Ron Paul could not have promised that he would rebuild all of America, that he would rebuild the entire military and not raise taxes. Ron Paul couldn't have done that, in all honesty. I couldn't have done it. Donald Trump could do it because he doesn't have an ideological base and he isn't particularly principled. He's a great showman. He's a populist. And you can't win like Donald Trump won unless you bring in a lot of Democratic voters, a lot of independents, and those would not have come to a principled position. He promised everybody a job. You're going to solve all the job problems. I'll tell you, it cannot be done. He even said, I'm going to solve all of the inner city problems. You're going to love it. It's going to be wonderful. I mean, how do you solve the inner city problems with jobs? How do you undo the character problems? You know, the inner cities are full of, and you know, at the risk of being called racist, there's a black American majority in many of these inner cities. And it's known demographically that most of those are single-parent families. The black males simply have sexual relations and abandon those women, wives and mistresses. And that's the way that it is in the black community in general, and especially in the inner city. Now, that's just a democratic fact. Now, no one can get caught saying that in the public or they'll be crucified, but that's the truth. You can't cure that with jobs. You can't cure a lazy mentality with jobs. Now, not everybody is lazy. But you know, it was interesting when I was doing a major project down in Georgia, I noticed that all of the construction workers were Latinos. There was not a single black American among all the construction crews that I supervised over a period of a year and a half on a major high-security construction project. Not a single black American. And I asked the locals, I said, where are the black Americans that used to be the construction workers here? They don't want to work. They're on welfare. It's because of the welfare mentality. They don't have to work. But the Latino illegals need to work because many of them didn't know they could go on welfare. Now they can, but they're still very, very hard workers and did a good job. Now, that's not saying that I'm for illegal immigration. I'm not. But they are good hard workers and they're doing the job now. But there is a major minority, racial minority in the country that is simply not working. And it's very, very difficult for them to get over that barrier. So what I want to tell you, though, is that even though Trump won the election, we, that is the constitutional or ideological conservative, Christian conservative minority, are a strong minority. We could never win an election alone. So don't get used to the fact of thinking that we're going to win this democratically. The only reason that Trump won is because he was a populist and he promised benefits to everyone. I mean, even enthused, even knowing that this was a pie-in-the-sky promise. I thought, wow, it just sounds wonderful. We're going to make America great again. You know, we're going to get rid of all these regulations. We're going to dump NAFTA. We're going to dump GAA and all of those other things. But it just really isn't going to happen that way. Now, what is going to happen, in my opinion, is that it's going to slow things down. Trump has bought us more time. He's bought us more time. It will slow down the globalist agenda. It will not stop it, and he will not remove any globalists. In fact, he's hiring a lot of people within his administration that aren't globalist conspirators, unless he puts Petraeus in. But all of these people are susceptible to the globalist and neocon philosophy. Every one of them. None of them are ideologically set against it. Even Steve Bannon of Breitbart News, even though he's anti-globalist, he comes from a leftist perspective, not from a conservative right perspective. There's a lot of leftists that are against globalism because they see it as greedy capitalism. They see all these wealthy globalists as greedy capitalists, not as a separate conspiracy for world control in and of itself. And that's what globalism really is. It isn't about the money. I mean, these people already have more money than anyone else in the world. They have yachts, multiple houses, islands, women, boats, airplanes, jets. What do they need more wealth for? It's not about money. It's about power and about the promise of immunity. That's what drives the globalist conspiracy. It's a satanic conspiracy that promises them immunity. Look at Bill Clinton. He got away with murder as president. Got away with, gross immorality. He was protected. Look at Hillary Clinton. Look at that FBI giving her a rubber stamp of approval. I mean, it was in fact, if anything that the establishment did to elect Donald Trump, it was having FBI Director James Comey exonerate Hillary Clinton. Everyone said, the system is rigged. They proved more than anything else. In fact, even the liberal media mentioned that. The greatest damage to Hillary Clinton was Comey's exoneration because it convinced people the system is rigged. And it was obvious for everyone to see. And then you had the leaked information from the FBI agents out of the investigative team saying we were just shocked. There was rebellion in the FBI. Comey's desk was full of letters of resignation from people wanting to quit the FBI. It was a major catastrophe. And that's what's happening all over the world. There's a rebellion against globalism by a very strong minority. But don't get set on the fact that you're a majority. You're not. Now, even the British voted against the EU in the Brexit vote, right? If they held another vote 2 weeks later, would it have won? It would not have won. The reason it won, first of all, is because they had paper ballots. They could not skew the vote electronically in Britain. It was a paper ballot election. The second thing is, a lot of people thought because the propaganda was the Brexit's going to lose, they didn't come out and vote. But the second time around, if you had another vote about Brexit, they would have come out en masse and said, we want our benefits. And they would have voted the Brexit down. But you watch in the Brexit situation how the globalists respond to this. First of all, you have a prime minister, and you look how Theresa May was put in as prime minister and how it was done without an election. They just did it among the controlled Conservative Party members in Parliament who elected her, and how they got rid of Boris, her opposition, who was a very strong, anti-EU person. The first thing that she did was say, I'm now going to champion the Brexit cause. And warning bells ought to go up when a globalist is like Obama saying, I'm really going to champion the Trump cause now that he's won the election. You wouldn't trust that, and you shouldn't trust Theresa May saying, who was anti-Brexit, that I'm going to make sure this goes through. What was the first thing she did with Parliament? She put in a bill, which she had Parliament pass, because the Conservatives had the majority, that they would inculcate within British law all EU laws and regulations. Now think about that. You've just voted to get out of the EU because of all these EU laws and regulations, and she says, now we're going to implement them as part of British law so that we can decide which ones we want to keep later on. But what do you start with putting them all in your law for? You got this weight of momentum, of judicial momentum. How do you get rid of those types of things once they're already in law? This was an extremely difficult coup that she pulled. And then she delayed, of course, the Brexit until next year while she's negotiating. But you see, the globalists are still very, very much in charge, and they control Theresa May. And so you have the opposition under the control of the globalists, just like in the United States, both Republicans and Democrats at the top levels of the parties are controlled by globalists. And so I'm not optimistic about much changing with globalism, with the Brexit. However, there will be some things. It will slow down the process. What's worse about the Brexit for the EU people is that France is now on the verge of having a major rebellion against the EU, with the National Front Party is the party to beat now. And that's why the French just elected to go up against Miss Le Pen, who's in charge of the National Front. They put in François Fillon, who's a Thatcher-type conservative. At least he's pretending to be that. In other words, how do you beat the right? You bring up as close to a right-wing sympathizer as you can so that it dilutes the direction of opposition going to the National Front. And the National Front wants to shut down virtually all further Muslim immigration in France. And they need to stop that because they're really outpopulating France. Almost 30% now are Muslims, and it's growing very, very rapidly. By 2050, they'll be the majority. And in a raw democracy, once you lose the majority, you've lost your ability to change things democratically. And that's the whole purpose of the illegal immigration here in the United States. It really bothers me when you have religious people in this state say, we don't care about the politics. We only want to concentrate on the humanitarian aspects of helping these people because we were once refugees. And there's a difference. We were refugees within our own country. It wasn't a different culture. These are refugees from a different culture. And there is a political aspect to this bringing refugees here that you cannot dismiss. And that is that there's a globalist agenda to water down and dilute conservative voting power in this state and across the nation. And that's what illegal voting is all about. That's why Obama said on a national Spanish television station, he says, when they asked him about illegals voting, and he said, well, don't worry about them, the INS coming and, you're not going to get arrested. You're not going to get deported over voting. He didn't say don't vote. You can't vote. He would just say, don't worry. You will not be prosecuted if you vote. Hint, hint. It was a very direct, this is an impeachable offense. For the President of the United States to openly advocate the violation of law should have been impeached for that. But of course he wasn't, because part of the purpose in Clinton being impeached, and it was sabotaged by the Republicans, that's what David Skippers, the Democrat prosecutor in the Clinton impeachment, said. It was the Republican senators who leaned on me to sabotage this investigation, who would not let me subpoena, who would not let me do this, who would not let me do that. It was the Republicans who saved Bill Clinton from impeachment. This is a very, very sophisticated conspiracy that we're dealing with. Now, let's look at what Trump is doing here in his cabinet picks, which I've covered extensively in the World Affairs Brief. Steve Bannon, as I said, comes from the anti-globalist left. He's actually a fan of FDR. He believes in big government spending programs, and that's why Trump likes him. He likes Trump's. We'll cover it all with money, and we'll just save. Trump says we're going to increase business, and we're going to, pay for all this with bringing companies back. And, that takes years. Even if you did craft the tax and regulatory atmosphere to allow companies to come back in, you just can't pull up a company that you've moved into China or Mexico and bring it back into the United States without extreme costs. And what do you do with all the infrastructure that you paid for with debt in the foreign countries? It's just not that simple. It might be 10 years at the best that you could start to see some of those countries migrate. The country isn't going to give Trump 10 years to show that kind of response. And certainly, you're not going to get the kind of tax revenues coming back into the country to pay for these massive infrastructure processes. And that's one of the reasons why he chose Steve Mnuchin as a Wall Street insider from Goldman Sachs to be Treasury Secretary. He's going to guarantee, as a Federal Reserve man, that the inflation will continue to pay for these. You're going to see much more inflation, and that's why the stock markets are booming. Not because they like Trump. Remember, there was this, just like the Brexit, the powers that be used their manipulated powers to pull down the stock markets in Britain and the pound to make people say, look, this is what happens when you vote to get out of the EU. But, of course, the real markets boomed back up within a couple of days. And it wasn't but a couple of hours after Trump was elected that the markets boomed back up because the smart money said, hey, Trump's going to be an inflationary guy. There's no way that, this is going to be a conservative, ratchet down, gold standard type reform in the monetary movement. And it won't be. And especially when you talk about rebuilding the military, it's amazing how much our military has really been beaten down by all of these wars of intervention around the country. Our equipment is worn out, filled with sand. They're having to rebuild most of the tanks. And a lot of those equipment they've just given away to the Iraqis, which, of course, were given away to ISIS after they turned tail and ran. It's amazing that they turned tail and ran without even fighting for Mosul. And now you have to destroy the whole city to go back in and conquer it. Now, ISIS would have had to do the same thing if they stood their ground. It's no easy thing to take over a whole city and keep it intact, unless you walk away and let ISIS take over, and that's exactly what happened. And I think that there was some skullduggery in there. We know that the United States was requested by the Mosul government, and not Mosul, but the Iraqi government under al-Maliki, to hit these great big weapons stockpiles that they had seen out in the desert with the various intelligence. And the U.S. refused because ISIS was their boys. They had created ISIS. And Hillary Clinton, in one of the emails from John Podesta, admitted that. She said that Saudi Arabia and Qatar are clandestinely financing ISIS. I don't know, the press didn't give that much coverage. But when they did give it a coverage, they said it was a hypothetical that Clinton was, it wasn't a hypothetical. Clinton was saying she knew. But it's interesting that even someone like Clinton, who's a semi-conspirator, who's a globalist, doesn't know the whole game plan. I don't believe she knows that the dark side of the government has actually created ISIS and is directing Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Turkey to finance ISIS. I don't think she realizes, or at least she doesn't ask any questions. She doesn't want to know. But this is one thing you have to understand. It's not just black and white in this globalist conspiracy. It isn't that you're a globalist and you know everything about the conspiracy, or you're not a globalist and you're ignorant. There's a whole world in between of predictable people who know there's a control system, who see part of it, who are going along with it, who don't ask any questions. They know better than to ask. And, we have an entire structure in the United States that's built to create and foment conspiracies. In the military, how many people know the rules about you never ask questions, you never challenge command, you just take orders. You don't ask questions, or you really get into trouble. You follow orders without question. And then while they will admit that there may be an illegal order, they'll never tell you or define what an illegal order is. They don't want you to question. And so, with the combination of yesmanship in the military and in government, and the fact that you have secrecy and need to know, it's national security, I can't tell you. I mean, how do you get to the truth? When you're seeing something that doesn't make sense and you're in the military, you're high ranking, you start to ask, national security, can't tell you, and you're told to just go away and nod your head and not ask questions. That's a beautiful, ground for conspiracy, and that's how it operates, so that you don't have to tell people. They like useful idiots like Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney is not a globalist conspirator. Mitt Romney is a moral individual. He's a good Latter-day Saint. And in fact, he thinks he's doing the will of the brethren by being acceptable to the establishment. I'm getting a favorable image of Mormonism, and he did when he ran for president. In fact, many fundamentalist Christians changed their opinion of Mormonism to one of a semi-favorable one from this cult-type image that it had. And Mitt Romney was doing that. But the price for doing that was that he had to make his bed with all of these globalists. From CFR, his entire campaign. I mean, he put Michael Chertoff in charge of his campaign and the personnel in his campaign. That's the Darth Vader of the dark side of government. Michael Chertoff. he hired to run his campaign. So he brought in all these CFR and trilateral globalists. The only thing that Romney did that they didn't like was he said some negative things about Russia. During that period of time in 2008, the establishment was still bending over backwards to say and to pacify Russia. That's been the globalist trend ever since the Cold War, is to say Russia's really not a threat. We can placate Russia by giving them weapons and arms and ammunition. That's why we gave them the technology of miniature ball bearings so that they could MIRV their missiles, meaning put multiple warheads on the missiles. That happened in a Republican administration. Richard Nixon. Who was his national security advisor who did it? Henry Kissinger, a globalist. I mean, the NSA, or the National Security Advisor, part of the National Security Council, is always the handler of the president, except during the George W. Bush administration. His handler was Dick Cheney, the vice president. The normal staff of the vice president is 6 people in that day and age. It's now 25. But Cheney's vice presidential staff grew to 600 because he was running the presidency from the vice president's office. It was Dick Cheney who tasked the Corps of Engineers to build an underground bunker under his residence at the Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C. And the only reason we found out about this new bunker being built was all the explosions were, waking people up at night, and the government finally had to admit they were excavating and doing a major underground bunker under the vice president's residence. And of course, during 9/11, we found out that there was another bunker under a major skyscraper in Washington, D.C. that we'd never known about. So that there's a real mix between corporations, big corporations, and government. And they say, look, and like the Denver airport, there's a complete city underneath the Denver airport. And that's why the project went $2 billion over cost. And, of course, there's been a lot of conspiracy theories about it and the Masonic symbols all over the airport. But it's true. There's an underground bunker city. It's the second headquarters of the dark side of government in Denver, Colorado. And that's why I don't recommend Colorado, especially the Denver area, for people for relocation. The globalists know that Washington, D.C. is going to get nuked someday. It's going to be totally devastated. And that's why they've got a secondary headquarters built under the Denver airport. And they've got all kinds of, black helicopters and other things. They used to say that was a conspiracy theory. Now, of course, everybody knows there's hundreds of black helicopters, not only in the CIA, but the Coast Guard and other people. I'm trying to remember where I was going before I diverted myself. Yes, in his cabinet. Now, for example, all of the cabinet people and his transition team, especially Kellyanne Conway, who's very, very, being a pollster, Trump's pollster, she's very much aware that Trump needs to placate the people who got him elected. And then you have Reince Priebus, who's a globalist, chairman of the Republican National Committee, now his chief of staff, who is pushing all of the Bush-type Republicans onto the Trump team. And there's this war going on between them. And so as kind of a compromise, they're all picking non-conspirators so far. That is, people who are not direct conspirators with the globalist combination, but people who are susceptible to it, who are nominally conservative, but who are mostly neocons. And what I mean by neocon, a neocon started with outright Democrats like Gene Kirkpatrick and William Kristol and others who decided to, they were for abortion, they were for homosexuality and all these social things, but they decided to become conservative in terms of militarism and defending America through patriotism. This was a prelude. It came after the Vietnam War. Remember in the Vietnam War, there were no yellow ribbons about support our troops during the Vietnam War, right? Why was that? It's because the Vietnam War was the last of the wars against communist expansion. And that's why the establishment sabotaged that war. All of us in the Vietnam era knew, my squadron, you couldn't arm your missiles until a missile was heading towards you. And you had to be radioing frantically for permission. Can I arm my missiles? Not yet, not yet. It's just stupid. And then you had all these safe havens on the Laotian side of the border in North Vietnam. They would retreat across the border and you couldn't handle them. All the military people were disgusted with their military hierarchy for being yes men to these rules of engagement. But after the Vietnam War, which destroyed, and the reason they allowed all of these protests was to embitter the American people against any wars of intervention against communism. And it did so, didn't it? But now when they had wars of intervention, they first of all needed a trigger event. And that was 9/11 to create this massive wave of patriotism and defensiveness. And they used 9/11, which was a government operation from beginning to end, including the hiring of the terrorists, the loading of explosives into the building. And as an aside here, Alex Jones keeps telling me, Trump's one of us. He knows everything about conspiracies. He's as good as you or I. I said, baloney. He can't be. He's best friends with Rudy Giuliani. And anybody who knows about 9/11 would know that Rudy Giuliani was in building number 7. That's where his emergency headquarters was. He knew it was going to be imploded by explosives. He told the firefighters to get everybody out of the building. He got out of the building, but he didn't tell the firefighters in building 1 and 2. He didn't tell them. That's why the New York firefighters hate Rudy Giuliani, because they know he betrayed them. So you can't tell me that Donald Trump knows. Now, he knows something about it. He knows. He reads very superficially, and he reads alternative news stuff. So he gets some of this. He's not smart enough to make an intelligent statement that can't be crucified by the press. When he got involved with Bush and the Osama bin Laden people, they just crucified him over there, even though generally what he said was true. And what happened, of course, in the Saudis in San Diego, they were caught feeding money from the Saudi embassy through one of the major sons of the ambassador to keep these San Diego 9/11 hijackers in their apartments while they were going to flight school in San Diego. And that's the reason the CIA kept the 28 pages hidden, because and the whole media gets half the story. The alternative media gets half the story. The story is, well, Saudi Arabia is guilty of fomenting 9/11. It isn't true at all. They're just working for the U.S. government. They're puppets of the U.S. government. The Saudis were doing it at the behest of the government, and that's why the government was protecting the Saudis, so the Saudis wouldn't be compelled to say, hey, we were doing it because the CIA told us to. That's the secret that they didn't want the Saudis to reveal. That's why they had to protect the Saudis. And that's why they're not going after the Saudis, even after Clinton knowingly said to Podesta, the Saudis and Qatar are clandestinely funding ISIS and arming ISIS. Why aren't they cutting off aid? Why are they selling arms to Saudi Arabia? Why are we continuing even after the bombing of Yemen and the killing of all those civilians? It's because Saudi Arabia is the #1 puppet of the United States in the Middle East, and they have to protect their puppet. And look at Erdogan in Turkey. I mean, this is just a disgrace. This guy is really all over the map, and I don't know who's going to kill him first, either the Russians or the globalists, because he is really playing fast and loose. He's now said that the only reason I've invaded Syria is because we're going to take down Assad. Well, the Russians, who just made peace with Erdogan, said, that's news to us. This loudmouth has just revealed that he's going to do something that we're not going to allow. And they won't allow it. But there's just so much these issues of foreign policy that Trump can't possibly understand. You have to remember that intelligence briefings are disinformation briefings. There's a whole system within the military. That's why there's competition. Defense Intelligence Agency, CIA. CIA is the most controlled. And, of course, they give briefings to the president. Defense Intelligence Agency also has a person that can give briefings, and that's why General Flynn got kicked out of Defense Intelligence Agency, because he didn't like what the CIA was briefing the president, which was soft on ISIS. He saw that there was disinformation going on there, because they kept telling the president, yeah, we're attacking ISIS and we're degrading them and killing them, etc. And the DIA knew, yeah, but we're not hitting any decent targets in ISIS. We're hitting empty buildings. We're warning them in advance so that nobody's in there when we do hit these strikes. I mean, the pilots don't know this. All they know is there's a target and I hit the target. A success, right? They didn't realize the target's empty because they were warned in advance to skedaddle out of there. The DIA realized that the U.S. wasn't hitting any of these oil convoys that were going into Turkey. And Turkey was marketing the oil to what of all? To Israel. Cheap oil for Israel coming directly out of ISIS. I mean, this is proof that there's collusion between the West and ISIS. And so he was demanding, look, you've got to start to hit these oil convoys. Before the U.S. could succumb to any of this pressure from Flynn at the DIA, the Russians went in there and bombed one of these oil convoys right at the border of Turkey. And they did that just to embarrass the United States. You see, if you were serious about ISIS, you'd be bombing these oil convoys. So what did the U.S. do the next week? They bombed an oil convoy. Once. They never did it again. And they sent a plane in there and passed out leaflets to all the drivers to abandon the trucks 45 minutes before the strike to make sure that nobody would be killed. And those oil tankers are still going into Turkey, except when they can get bombed by the Russians. But the Russians are making hay out of the U.S. policy because Putin understands. Now, Putin is not a nice guy. Any of you who know my understanding from the World Affairs Brief, I've documented very, very clearly over the years that the fall of the Soviet Union was a carefully crafted deception. The communists just went underground. They gave orders to Honecker in Germany to let these riots go forward. They gave orders to Ceausescu in Romania to stand down. He refused. He was killed. Honecker got to leave and go to Chile. But he admitted on his deathbed that Moscow gave him orders to allow the student riots in Leipzig to go forward. And why wouldn't they? They're not going to riot when they know that all of their student organizations are infiltrated by the Stasi, and they'd be in jail as soon as they started to say anything about revolution. In fact, there was a very interesting documentary about the fall of the Soviet Union, where it talked about Russian dissidents who were taking part in the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And the guy said, there's only one thing that bothered me. He was speaking Russian, and there was a translator. He says, where were the KGB? We never understood. How come the KGB just let us get out there and protest and rally for Yeltsin? And of course, the media, the U.S. media who was printing it, didn't pick up on that. Where were the KGB? Are we to believe that Gorbachev in his undefended villa couldn't be captured by the KGB after overthrowing hundreds of governments around the world? I mean, this was a phony coup. Are we to believe that the heads of the GRU, the KGB, the Defense Ministry fled for their lives after the failed coup? That's what the media said. Who does the head of the KGB flee from? Who does the defense minister flee from? He's the guy who's supposedly ahead of all the military. Nobody asks those questions in the West. Am I the only smart person in the world that says, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense? Nobody asked the question, except myself and one other British analyst who later died and was strongly persecuted because he doubted a lot of the Holocaust story. But he saw it. He published it all over Britain and got a lot of flack for it. The Western media was complicit in the conspiracy to let the Soviet Union fall. In fact, there was a very grand piece of disinformation promoted on Alex Jones on one Steve Pachenik. If any of you have seen his video claiming that he brought down the Soviet Union, that he and a lot of Americans who were over there in Russia, that they got together and talked how to peacefully dismantle the Soviet Union. He took credit for it, said the U.S. brought it down. It's just making it up out of whole cloth. And yet, because from Alex Jones, a lot of good conspiratorial people believe it. The Steve Pachenik is a fraud from the beginning. He claims to be an insider, still working for the government, yet he can talk to Alex Jones. Does that make sense? Nobody gets to talk to Alex Jones or Steve Quayle or any of these other people who believe in conspiracy unless they're plants from government. No such thing as a DHS insider who's allowed to leak every week to the veterans of, what's that organization? Veterans, anyway, it's Hagman's organization, the Intel Hub, and it's, these people may well be sincere, but once you allow so-called insiders to call you and you repeat their information, you're labeled as a dummy. You're labeled as somebody who can be unknowingly fed disinformation. I never take calls from people claiming to be insiders. First of all, I have no way to check it out. But I know with NSA spying that there's no way that they could be telephoning me without being caught. So they can't be a true insider on our side. It's just not true. So be very aware of people who claim to have sources from insiders. So let's talk about some of the other things now. I've talked about Steve Bannon being a big government FDR type. Rance Priebus, of course, is a globalist working to control and co-opt the Trump administration. Here's a weakness that Trump has that makes him susceptible to this. He, of course, is really under a lot of pressure and criticism because of his inability to control what he says. A lot of people say he's COINTELPRO, he's working for the other side, he's just fooling us. And I say that just can't be true. Donald Trump can't control his own script. He won't even read his own script, let alone a globalist script. He just cannot control himself. It's just unbelievable that Donald Trump is a controlled entity because he just can't control his mouth. Now, I think he's actually a basically good person, despite his sexual lasciviousness and proclivities. I think he's basically a good person. All of his family says he's a good person. All of his workers say he's a good person. Now, the people that he stiffed in bankruptcy don't think he's a good person. You know, the best thing that Trump could have done during the campaign when they brought up these bankruptcy things and how, right on the debate, you stiffed this and here's the architect in the audience who you refused to pay. And of course, instead of saying, I wasn't satisfied with his work, that wasn't true at the time, by the way. What he could have said is, I'm going to announce here now, here's a guy who's worth billions of dollars. He says, I'm going to set aside $2 million and I'm going to pay off the people who feel like they have been, messed up in the bank. What would that have bought him? $2 million. That's peanuts compared to the campaign. It would have bought him so much goodwill. Think about it. He just wasn't thinking when he failed, when he went defensive instead of just offering to give these people paid off. But that's because Donald Trump is not a controlled entity. He's a person who is a populist. I think he obviously has enough truth that he reads the alternative media. He believes Greg Phillips when he says there were 3 million illegals that voted. Now, sadly, Greg Phillips has not produced the data yet to back up that statement. He's got his data analysis, and he made the announcement, which got Trump and other things. But when the media came to them, he said, well, I don't have the data ready yet. And it still hasn't been revealed. That's not very smart to make that kind of accusation before you've got the ability, to back up, because then the press is going to crucify you on that. I think that his pick of Senator Jeff Sessions was a good pick generally. He's not an insider. He's a very, very good conservative. However, he, like most of the conservatives in his cabinet, is so pro-patriotism and law enforcement that he fails to see the evil in law enforcement. Asset forfeiture is something no conservative should be for. To be able to take someone's property without proving that a crime is committed and confiscate the property. It's happening all over the nation. And he's a supporter of asset forfeiture. He's a supporter of NSA spying. Probably the worst pick so far in Trump's cabinet is Representative Pompeo for CIA director. This is interesting because almost all of the picks of Donald Trump were leaked to the press. The reason they leaked that is to test the response among the Trump supporters. When they leaked Mitt Romney's thing, of course, these Trump supporters went apoplectic about that. They should have gone apoplectic when he leaked about Petraeus being considered for Secretary of State. This guy is really dangerous. This is like Hillary Clinton being Secretary of State. There's 1,000 emails between Hillary Clinton and Petraeus when he was chairman or heading CENTCOM, Central Command, down there in the Middle East, and every one of those 1,000 emails is missing from the server of Hillary Clinton. They're all in the CENTCOM server that the FBI checked into, and they're all missing. So Hillary Clinton obviously saw, I got to remove all of these emails from Petraeus because they would show that Petraeus is in league with Clinton on many things. So for Trump to come away, and this is one of the weaknesses I said about Trump, he's extremely impressed by people who can spout off all kinds of sophisticated information to him. Like Henry Kissinger. Wow, Henry Kissinger just impressed the heck out of him. And so did David Petraeus. He just couldn't say enough about how much he learned about the world. But it's just disinformation. I'll tell you how complex it is. He obviously got briefed on Iran. And Trump is against the Iran agreement. Well, the Iran agreement is very, very sophisticated because everybody says, everybody wonders, why did the U.S. give this agreement to Iran? Even Iran wants to know why the U.S. gave them that agreement. But let me tell you specifically how it happened. First of all, this happened about 3.5 years ago when the United States was just ready to start a no-fly zone into Syria. I don't know if you remember that. It's ancient history now. But 3.5 years ago, they were about ready to do a Libyan-style no-fly zone. And it doesn't mean a no-fly zone. A Libyan-style no-fly zone is a you can't fly, but we throw everything at you. And it's an invasion from the air. Cruise missiles, rockets, special forces, everything they throw at them and overthrew Libya, basically, by decapitating the Libyan army in a so-called no-fly zone. Well, they were going to do one in Syria, and so John Kerry sat before a London press conference, and a reporter said, it's very obvious you're going to invade Syria. Is there anything that Assad can do to stop this? And Kerry, just off the top of his head, said, they could give up their chemical weapons and we wouldn't attack. And Assad said, I accept. It just shocked him. I think Kerry got the tongue lashing of his life when he got off that stage. You fool, you just ruined, we can't invade now. And so what happened is that you remember that up until this time, we'd had 3 carrier groups off of Iran threatening to attack Iran. Ever since 2006, we'd had 3 carrier groups up there. The only reason they stood down once was when Ron Paul was running for president in 2008. And they said, what did the National Intelligence Estimate come out and say? Suddenly we've determined that Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon and they aren't trying to get a nuclear weapon. And everyone said, what? After pumping the press for years about Iran and the nuclear, all of a sudden they don't have a nuclear weapon, that they've stopped their nuclear. How do you say that? Well, they did it specifically to have an excuse to stand down, because if they attacked Iran when Ron Paul was running, and the fever, anti-war fever was very strong, he would have surged to the beginning of to the top of the Republican nomination. They didn't want to do that, so they dumped the Iran attack. And they did it again after they stood down in Syria, and here's what happened. The reason that they were going to attack Syria, and the reason why they switched from Iran to Syria, is that Israel said, look, we're not going to attack Iran on your behalf until you take down Syria. Syria is right next door to us. They have all these missiles, all these chemical weapons. They can get past our Iron Dome system by inundating us with a barrage of missiles, 1,000 missiles at a time. We can't stop at 4 or 5. So the U.S. agreed to take down Syria before Iran. Now, because Israel has always been tasked to start the war with Iran. And one of the reasons for getting U.S. troops in Afghanistan and Iraq was so that Iran could have troops nearby to retaliate against. That would give the U.S. an excuse to hit Iran. Israel can start the war, but Israel can't finish it. The U.S. would finish it, but it can't do it until it gets struck or bloodied by Iran. So there's a very sophisticated setup of people wondering, why, after 9/11, go after Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan when they're not even involved in 9/11? The reason is because we wanted American troops there. The real target was Iran, and it still is. Why Iran? Because Iran is the only Muslim country that's capable of and trying to become self-sufficient in weapons production. Tanks, airplanes, missiles, atomic weapons, everything. And if you had a big bullseye on your chest from the globalist New World Order, you'd be trying to do the same thing too. But that's why they're after Iran. Now, but once you had to stand down in Syria, they had to have an excuse to stand down the military forces in Iran. And that's why the U.S. made the overture to Iran about, let's make a deal on nuclear weapons. And the Iranians were shocked. After all this persecution, all these sanctions, and they were desperate to get rid of the sanctions, and they were really hurting Iran. And they were shocked. The U.S. is coming to us and saying, let's make a deal. And what's interesting is they baited the Iranians. There were 3 major sessions for these negotiations, 3 major stages of these. In the first stage, the United States came in and says, you don't have to hardly give up a thing, just a few token things. And Iran says, we agree. And the U.S. came out and announced it in the press conference, and they suddenly said they've agreed to give up half of their centrifuges and all of their uranium and all. And Iran said, wait a minute, we didn't agree to any of that. The U.S. had suckered them into saying we agree, and then they changed the terms in the public press conference. And in fact, Iran said, and you never heard this in mainstream media, said, we have the transcripts. We can prove that we didn't agree to that. And you never heard that in the media because they would publish what Iran had in the transcripts to show the U.S. was lying. The U.S. did that again in the second stage of negotiations. But But you see, they've suckered Iran in. They knew they had to get rid of the sanctions. They said, well, maybe we can accept some of these that they demanded of us. And so they came into the second level. And when they made the public announcement about the agreement, they upped it again. And Iran said, look, we didn't agree to that. And they did that the third time. In fact, in the third time, it wasn't about nuclear. They had issues about conventional missiles and conventional weapons put into the treaty as well. And Iran finally agreed to it because they were so desperate to get rid of the sanctions. But guess what? Iran has not signed the agreement, and the U.S. has not signed the agreement. But what they did is they took it before the Security Council and had the Security Council accept the agreement. And part of the agreement in the Security Council languages is that if Iran is found in violation of any of these parts, that it's an automatic authorization to go to war against Iran. That's what the agreement is all about. It's an automatic authorization. So don't have to go to Congress, don't have to go to a debate in the Security Council. It's already been authorized as soon as they declare Iran in violation. And so this agreement is a trap. It's a trap to have an excuse when they're ready to go back and take out Iran. So when Mattis, General Mattis is going to be Secretary of Defense, he's what we call an Iranophobe, like Islamophobe, meaning fear Iran. Iran is the boogeyman. He's been the subject of too much intelligence briefings about the evils of Iran. Now, Iran is not a nice nation. I'm not here to defend Iran. But Iran has some legitimate gripes against the United States and the globalists that have been trying to undermine them for years. In fact, the globalists set up the Ayatollah Khomeini to come in and replace the Shah. They undermined the Shah. And, you know, the Ayatollah Khomeini was being kept in a villa in France for many years at CIA expense. So here's the enemy of the Shah is being kept in his digs in France by the CIA at taxpayers' expense, allowed to come back in, and then they hold hostage all the Americans in the embassy. I mean, this whole game about who's an enemy and who's a friend is very, very mixed up in the globalist world because they believe in conflict creation. That's why they always play both sides, Republicans and Democrats, anti-Castro people and pro-Castro people. They brought Castro to power, by the way. If you read the book Dagger in the Heart by Lasso, it's an amazing story about how the CIA and the State Department actually brought Castro to power and cut off all aid to Fulgencio Batista. And it did the same to Anastasio Somoza in Nicaragua. We brought the Sandinistas to power. I mean, this is just treason if you didn't understand it was actually globalism. My uncle, W. Clem Skousen, was raised believing that it was just communists in the State Department. And Ezra Taft Benson, too, believed it was the communist conspiracy doing this. What they failed to realize until later, at least my uncle, is that there were non-communists protecting the communists in the State Department. Non-communists that were attacking, those that were trying to root out the communists in the State Department. And those were globalists because they were using communism to destroy the Western world. They come into the rescue then, and that's what happened. They came in and fought against the Sandinistas after they had brought them to power. So it's very sophisticated, and just like this Iran agreement, you see the neocons are claiming that the Iran agreement is bad, but the ones that are globalists at least know darn well the real purpose of the Iran agreement. And they're just playing as if they're against it. But Mattis, being against the Iran agreement, and Trump, he's following into their trap. But it gives me hope in one sense that Mattis isn't a globalist. He's been given false intelligence briefings for so long as a general that he believes in, the phony war on terror, and he believes in the Iran threat. But he doesn't realize that the globalists really want the Iran agreement. They don't want it dismantled. And even if it is dismantled, remember the U.S. hasn't signed it and Iran hasn't signed it. You got to dismantle it from the UN Security Council, and Trump doesn't have the authority to do that. So the globalists are very smart in how they've set up this trap for Iran. And you mark my words, someday they're going to declare, and that's why they went and accelerated all these requirements and got Iran to eventually be tricked into accepting. They could set them up for violations in the future. And believe me, there's no way that Iran cannot violate all of the provisions of that treaty. So that's the real purpose, and that's the reason why we went into Syria for the no-fly zone, and when it got kicked out, and Assad agreed to the chemical weapons thing, first of all, the U.S. tried to say that he was in violation of it. The UN came in and said, no, he's not in violation. And so the U.S. had to create ISIS. What they did is take about 50% of all of the rebels in Syria, and they said, all right, you're now ISIS. I mean, how do you get a terrorist organization of over 50,000 people to be created overnight? You do it simply by changing names. And of course, they got first priority on all the shipments from Turkey and Saudi Arabia for the arms. That's why there was a great big arms depot in Iraq. That Iraq was crying to the United States to get a bomb those. Somebody's planning on attacking us, and the U.S. refused. That's why the U.S. refused after the taking of Mosul. ISIS had a major celebration parade with all their tanks and other things going through the city streets and out along the highway, and U.S. air power didn't hit them. You don't think the U.S. knew? They had satellites, of course, watching the whole battle of ISIS. They didn't know that there was an unexposed column that they could have obliterated with air power, and they didn't do it because ISIS is our boys. Now, there's a problem. And that's why in all of the previous battles for ISIS, they've always let ISIS escape to fight another time. And that's why almost none of the ISIS fighters were killed in Fallujah. They all escaped because the U.S. left a portion of it wide open so that they didn't get trapped. The same thing is happening in Mosul. They left the western sector open so that any ISIS fighters could leave. Now, unfortunately, most of the ISIS fighters are fighting it out in house to house, so a lot of them are going to get killed. But the U.S. doesn't care. I mean, they can recruit other fighters. We're now finding out, for example, you know, these other so-called Somalis and things that have become recruited in the United States to go fight for ISIS, and the same thing in Belgium and France. We now found out that there's secret funding from the CIA to pay their way. How else do these penniless refugees get to Syria to go fight for ISIS? There's a clandestine funding organization that pays these people to go. And that's why they come back and they're not caught by France or anybody. How did they go to Syria and they were tracked going to, but they can't get caught coming back in? I mean, French intelligence is involved in the same dark side activities as the CIA, so is German intelligence. They've really corrupted the entire Western world with these black sites, and they pay billions of dollars to these countries to host these sites, and they can't say no to the money. What I'm trying to paint you a very specific picture is why Trump isn't going to get rid of the conspiracy. In fact, he'll be lucky if he lives, because they have the power to take him out, just like John F. Kennedy. You look at the John F. Kennedy assassination, this is a textbook case of how deeply involved the dark side of government was within so many of the agencies. They were in control of the Secret Service, protecting the president. How do we know this? Because some of the supervisors told the CIA agents they were not to ride the bumper of the limousine. That was standard procedure to protect the president. Ride the bumper. Told them to get off the bumper. In the JFK assassinations, none of those Secret Service agents were called to testify about who gave them orders to get off the bumper. Because Gerald Ford and what's the senator, Arlen Specter, who was running the prosecution, these were all controlled people. Even the Chief Judge of the Supreme Court, who was on the Warren Committee, Chief Justice Warren. These were all controlled individuals, except one of them, and he had to be removed from the committee because he refused to go along with it. So this is, but look, they controlled the Secret Service. They changed the windshield of the limousine because when they realized there were bullet holes from the front. And so they tried to falsify it by putting in a new windshield, shooting it from the rear so that they could change the direction of the bullets. That was documented in David Lifton's book. Then, of course, there was the false autopsy. They took JFK's body, put him in a military casket, and had an elaborate casket, which was empty on the airplane. They took the real casket off, sent it by helicopter to the Army Medical Center there in Washington, D.C., and had an autopsy, took the head off and removed all the bullet fragments and tried to cover up that there was a bullet from the front. All the evidence that pointed to the grassy knoll shooting him from the front. And then when the doctors saw the body come into Bethesda, they opened up the body bag and the doctor said, whoa, this body's already had an autopsy. Top of the head fell off and the brain wasn't there. The FBI agents recorded it dutifully. J. Edgar Hoover buried it. direct evidence that there was a conspiracy going on to alter the body. The X-ray technician taking the X-rays of the body at Bethesda, walking across the mezzanine with the X-rays of the body of JFK, and sees Jackie Kennedy come in the mezzanine of Bethesda Hospital with the coffin. Proof that JFK is not in the coffin. None of that came out in the 3 JFK hearings, and yet it's in open books. There's much more that I could tell you. But you see, when you control the FBI, when you control doctors, you get the autopsy doctor to change his written autopsy to falsify it. You just control a lot of people. And they don't have to be knowing conspirators. They simply have to be told, look, your life is on the line, and your wife and your children. If you utter a word, you're dead. And it's only after 30-some years that some of these people have come forward before they're dying, including one of the hitmen on the mafia in prison, admitted that he was a CIA mafia hitman. He worked for both, and then he was on the grassy knoll shooting at the president. So this is a major conspiracy. You're not going to get rid of it by electing a president if you don't have control of the dark side of government. I mean, think what you would have to do to dismantle this conspiracy. You'd, first of all, even if you were Ron Paul, who I trust implicitly, although he doesn't want to admit conspiracy because he knows he'd be crucified, but even if he were president, as an honest man, if you tasked the NSA to get the evidence on Kissinger and Brzezinski and Strobe Talbot and all these other globalists conspiring, what do you think the NSA would come back on with? 0. There's nothing there. So what's the president going to do? Go down and man the wiretapping things himself? When the dark side controls the law enforcement agencies, I mean, it's very, very difficult to undo this. And you don't undo it without force. You certainly can't undo it by democratic means. That's why J. Reuben Clark said, once you lose your liberty, you never gain it back without bloodshed. So, while I want to disabuse you of any notions that Trump is going to save us and give back our liberties, it's not going to happen. But what it will do is give us more time. If he does nothing else but slow down or stop illegal immigration and the flow of refugees from Africa and Somalia, he will stop 2 agendas. One, the conflict creation agenda that happens because Muslims never integrate fully and well within society. And number 2, he'll stop the watering down of our electoral power with Democratic voters. And that's the main reason for the illegal immigration thing, is to make sure that we can never win an election again. Now remember, if I'm right, the only reason we won this election was because so many populists joined us, right? If we alone, principled conservatives, voted, we would have lost by a landslide. But by bringing in populists, which no principled conservative could have done, could have made the promises that Trump brought. But in that sense, it's a God-given gift to us. Not that Trump is a messenger of God, but we've been given more time. This nation, in my opinion, is not righteous enough to merit winning back your liberty. But as I have said in my previous briefings to this group, I believe he will save a remnant. And you're part of that remnant here today. The people who know and understand and who are aware. And one of the saddest things, of course, is that you're a very, very small minority, even among the LDS community, which is the only religious group in the whole face of the earth that has actual scripture that they accept that warns them about secret combinations. And yet they don't see it. Because it would bring them under persecution. It would bring them under the same bad-mouthing that you receive if you ever utter your mouth about conspiracies. They're too embarrassed. They're more important to them, most of them, to seek the approval of the world. And they don't want to dare risk that. I have a brother, I'm ashamed to admit, knows that conspiracy exists, but he will never admit it in public because he won't be able to be allowed on national TV again. They'll blackball him if he admits to conspiracy. So it's a tough thing to overcome, but he's going to slow it down, hopefully. He's already waffling on compromising a lot of things. He's still strong about building a wall. Says some of it will be a fence now, but fine. If it's a good fence, I mean, at least it's going to stop things. It's pretty tough to do. You know, you have Indian tribes along the border filing lawsuits to stop him from doing that. I frankly think that Donald Trump's going to have to declare a state of emergency to get that fence built. There's a golf course on the bend in the Rio Grande that isn't going to allow the fence on their beautiful golf course. But he needs to use executive power to get that fence built. But he's waffling on sending the rest of the illegals back. Kellyanne Conway keeps saying, well, after the wall is built and after we've stopped illegal immigration, then we're going to decide what to do. And that means we're going to look for ways to let them stay. I have proposed in my World Affairs brief, I sent a copy to the Trump team, never heard back from them, but I said, what you really need is a really strong incentive to self-deport. And it really works. You say, you've got 6 months to leave the country. Sell your property, get your affairs in order, take all your money with you, take your children. I don't care if the Supreme Court says they're U.S. citizens. You don't have to break up your families. You can still take your U.S. citizen children back to Mexico with you. And then say, but at the end of 6 months, if you're caught within this country, we're going to confiscate everything you have, and there'll be immediate detention, no hearing. You're going back to Mexico, and there'll be a fine. We'll confiscate everything that you possess. Now, you don't think there's going to be a mad flood to get across the border before that 6 months? You bet there is. Yes, the criminal illegals, they would probably still want to stay. They're going to hide out, and they're going to take their chances. But you treat them ruthlessly, and you don't send them up with a 6 months appointment to come back, 6 months before an immigration judge out of the country. You have no rights, but you have to declare an emergency. You've got to overcome the courts, who have always defended the illegal aliens because they're part of the conspiracy. Just like in California, you had the proposition denying illegal aliens medical care and free public schooling, and the courts overturned it. That's what's going to happen. So Trump has the power to declare an emergency. And of course, the liberals that gave the president that emergency power for untoward purposes are going to hate the fact that he's going to use it, but he can use it. It's right there. And that's what you have to do to get some things done in the country. And I, not a great proponent of using emergency powers, but when it comes to a conspiracy of power that you have no power to overcome democratically, and naive people say, well, just change the law if you don't like it. Well, when you don't have the majority anymore, you can't change the law. And when your fundamental rights are being violated, you must take action at some point. Now, one of the things that I've always been part of in my life is preparing to lose. We fight to win, we fight to change, we fight to do it, but we have to prepare to lose. One of the greatest weaknesses in our movement is that we keep listening to voices saying, we're going to win, we're going to win. And so we delay preparation for losing until it's upon you, and then the preparations are too late. Now, as I've told you in previous briefings, once a year I come before this group, we are facing a major world war that's coming, and it's going to be Russia and China. Now, Russia is doing us a good service in Syria. They have decided to break their normal thing, which is don't interfere, let the U.S. run rampant over Iraq, which they did. They had an agreement with Iraq to defend them. They didn't live up to that agreement. And why did they do that? Because they wanted to eavesdrop on U.S. military operations. They wanted to capture all our electronic signatures from our bombing runs and from our radar and our detection and our ECM, jamming the Iraqi. They wanted to get all the signatures so they could develop countermeasures to our electronic countermeasures, and that's what they've done. Apparently they have enough of that now, and they decided, all right, now it's time to intervene and save Assad. Now, Assad has not been guilty of chemical weapons violations. The U.S. brought chemical weapons in through Turkey and Saudi Arabia, and the rebels set them off in urban areas to blame it on Syria. The Russians did not bomb hospitals in Aleppo. What the Aleppo rebels did, which is al-Nusra, an al-Qaeda front supported by the U.S., is that they put combatants into makeshift hospitals. They move into the combat areas to draw the fire of Russian airstrikes so that then they can paint them black. They send in white helmets. A UN organization that has done nothing but work for the rebels to falsify accounts of atrocities. Now, I'm not saying that Assad is perfect, but he's a Western-trained medical doctor. He's a very mild-mannered individual. He inherited a fairly ruthless regime from his father, who was in league with the Russians originally as a communist, but he is not that type of person. He's deliberately tried to keep his nation from being destroyed. It's not a civil war. This is an invasion by U.S.-supported rebels that have done, and believe me, heaven help the Syrian people if the U.S. ever allows the rebels to run rampant over Syria, it's going to be a bloodbath. And the Russians know that, and they've decided, here's a time to stick poke a finger in the eye of the globalists and show and embarrass the United States for not fighting ISIS and to save Assad. And they're doing a good job there. But that does not mean they're good guys. They are planning on attacking the West. Putin is the follow-on leader of the phony fall of the Soviet Union. He, in fact, did a purge of the original oligarchs who were the old communist leaders, like Boris Berezovsky, who he had assassinated in England, and various other people. Now he's got his own group of oligarchs around him, and Putin is probably the wealthiest man in the entire world. He gets a 4% percentage of everything that goes in and out of Russia through the borders. He takes a percentage of that. That's why he's got that gold palace in Sochi where the Olympics were. I mean, this is not a nice guy. Even though he's doing us a service by sticking a finger in the eye of the globalists in Syria, he is trying to take over Ukraine and take back the original Soviet nations. And by the way, as I may have told you last year, in this, I'm the only analyst who pointed this out, but the Ukrainian crew, contrary to Alex Jones and all the other alternative right media, is not a pro-Western coup. It wasn't a CIA coup. It was a Russian coup in favor of the West. It's part of the same thing they pulled as the phony fall of the Soviet Union, is to gain aid and trade from the West, thinking that the Ukraine is now a pro-Western government. Look at the facts. In 2014 February, when they had this these tire-burning riots, the Maidan independence movement, remember, in Kiev and the square, they were burning all these tires. And you have to ask yourself, why, first of all, didn't the Berkut, the riot police, go in and clean it out? I mean, they had all the weapons. But they let them riot for many, many years, or many, many months. And then finally, they made a deal with President Yanukovych, who was a Russian puppet, with the ostensible leaders of the opposition. But the opposition in the streets didn't accept them. It was like a phony opposition. They made a deal, going back to some agreement. And on Friday of that agreement, the opposition street says, we're not standing down. We don't accept this agreement. We don't accept these so-called opposition leaders, one of them which was a neo-Nazi group. And remember, there are no neo-Nazis except government-produced neo-Nazis, like the Aryan nations, in Idaho. When I visited them, there were all these little Nazi flags on their desks. And I asked them, you pretend to be conservative Christians. What's with the Nazi flag? That's socialism. Well, that's what the leader, Reverend, what's his name, told us to do. And I found out that most of the people in the room, in fact, had a story that they were former criminals who were caught on a parole violation. They were given a choice by the FBI, either go back to jail or go to work undercover for us in the Aryan nations. Well, they were all undercover, which means there were no real, native white nationalist neo-Nazis. They were all government agents. So you've got to watch out for the Ku Klux Klan and the neo-Nazis now, because they're there to paint the right wing black. And look what happened on Friday. The opposition in the street says, we don't accept that agreement. But on Friday, it's very interesting, the Berkut, the riot police, stayed in their barracks. Now think about that. They stayed in their barracks, and so the opposition had the run of the city hall and the presidential palace. There were no guards in the presidential palace. And all of them said the Maidan won. And Yanukovych had to flee for his life because of all the so-called armed people in the Ukrainian opposition, maybe 6 arms, 6 rifles, against a whole army that he had to do. And he had to flee. Flee from who? Nobody in the press asked those questions. Nobody asked who gave the orders to the Berkut to stay in their barracks. Nobody. Am I the only smart journalist in the world to ask who gave the order to the Berkut? It just accepted it. And I gave an example in the World Affairs Brief. I said, it's like we constitutionalists burning tires in Washington, D.C., and they let us do that for 2 months and block traffic. How believable is that? And then all of a sudden, one day, the Democrats and the Republicans that we don't accept as representatives cut a deal, and we say, we don't accept that deal, and then the Marines don't show up to guard the White House. And we have the run of the White House. And then on Saturday, the Democrats vote to oust Barack Obama. Now, how many of you would believe that we really won that? Who of us gave the order to the Marines not to guard the White House or the Congress? I mean, it's just, when you put it in terms of that, everyone says, oh yeah, I see. But you know, when they hear all this propaganda about $5 billion the CIA poured into Ukraine and that this is all a Western coup against Russia, well, it isn't a Western coup. Poroshenko works for the Russians. All his best friends are oligarchs from Moscow. And what is the first thing he did? Antagonize the Russian minority in eastern Ukraine by saying, now I realized I promised that you could speak Russian, but now I'm rescinding that promise. I mean, why antagonize them? And then you sabotage the Ukrainian army so they can't win any of the battles. And these guys are not that incompetent. But what I'm just saying is the Ukrainian government, just like the Timoshenko government that claimed to be conservative before, works for Moscow, and they're playing like they're part of the West so as to antagonize their own people against the West. That's why this pro-Western government let those neo-Nazis, the so-called Freedom Party, into their, so as to blacken the name of the right wing. So this is a very sophisticated world we live in. And that's one of the reasons I publish the World Affairs Brief every week, to try to let you know what the inside story is from a conspiratorial point of view and what they're really going on about. And so I am cautiously optimistic that we'll get some benefits out of Trump. I mean, he is under pressure to live up to some of his campaign promises. He's compromising on most of them. I mean, he even, for example, on the Obamacare said, well, I want to keep the part that allows that forces the insurance companies to take in people with prior existing conditions. Well, what is it that drove all the premiums high in Obamacare? It's prior existing conditions. You're going to keep that? How are you going to lower premiums? How are you going to get rid of the mandate? If you take away all the people like me who don't use insurance, you know, who buy medical cost share and other things, you know, we're not going to subsidize this system. So it's just not going to work. I mean, there's no way. I mean, look, insurance is the whole reason that medical costs are rising. Why? Because you don't have to pay. Insurance is paying. So you don't resist the sky-high prices, do you? Your insurance pays, maybe there's a copay of $300 on a $1,200 MRI, and you say, okay, I can pay that. But you don't protest the $1,300. That's why they went from $300 to $1,300, is because there was no resistance to paying it. Because insurance, that was the trap of making it a tax benefit to corporations to give insurance, is to cause prices to rise. And what happens when prices rise? People say, we've got to have insurance. And now there was that demand, we've got to have reasonable insurance, and the Affordable Care Act, affordable, was promised you affordable insurance. And now what's happened? They knew that it wasn't going to be affordable. They knew exactly where it was headed. And what is it going to lead to? Single-payer system, government subsidizing everybody's insurance. And that's what they wanted in the first place. But that's the step-by-step conflict creation process that they used to fool you into doing that. And the only way to be out of the system is to be healthy and to learn natural remedies and to stay away from it. I mean, even though I've been forced to do a medical cost share type of insurance, nevertheless, I still don't use it. I don't like to go to doctors. They only have drugs. They don't know anything about real internal medicine and real prevention. You've got to get handle on your health and learning to, lose weight, exercise, eat properly, and if we're going to survive. I will take a question at this point. Go ahead.
They should assassinate Trump. Immediately, the dark side would take over and things would go to hell in the handbasket real quick, right?
This question was, or his comment was, that if they would assassinate Trump, the dark side could immediately take over. It's not exactly that way. Mike Pence, as the vice president, is a weak but a true conservative. In other words, you saw how he gave in on that anti-discrimination bill, which he was correct in. You've got to have a right to say, it's my right to discriminate against anybody I want in housing or employment. I don't have to hire anybody. Once you give government the power to say, you cannot exclude certain people, you've lost a major fundamental right. He failed to defend that. He backed down immediately and I think that Pence would roll over and become, he's not a conspirator, but I think he could be very easily controlled. And it's the same way with almost everybody in his cabinet right now. Even though they may not be knowing conspirators, they can be bent to do the will of the conspiracy because they've got all these sophisticated, rational, and they have all this intelligence they can feed the president. It's fake. You talk about fake news, the intelligence briefings the president gets. It is not that they're absolutely false, But they don't tell them the things that I've told them. They didn't tell them about the U.S. created. I don't know of hardly anybody except a dozen people maybe in the National Security Council that knows that the U.S. created ISIS. The rest are being fed this line that ISIS is just terrible, we've got to get rid of it, and they're using their patriotism. And I think Pence would be a sucker for that, and so would others. But you're right, and the essence is that the dark side would take over. But remember, the dark side is going to still try to control Trump, and they're doing a pretty good job as it is now. I mean, just by having Pompeo in at the CIA, it's not going to stop any of that. If he puts in a NSA director that isn't anti-NSA spying, nothing's going to change. So the dark side isn't going to get back in. It's already in. Trump isn't going to remove it, and it's going to keep on moving. What the only thing I can see him stopping is refugees and immigration, because he can't back down on that without backlash.
What happens if Trump is assassinated before taking office?
His question was, what happens if Trump is assassinated before taking office? Once again, it would go to Pence as the vice president. In other words, once you're elected, the same chain of command would take over after that. Sir?
Stated that you believe that we're going to come to a nuclear war between the United States, Russia, and China. Do you believe that the election of Trump has on that time frame, or is it still looking somewhere around the
Yeah. Well, I've never given a date. What I've said is I don't think it'll happen before the Russians and Chinese are ready. And this is what's interesting, is that even though Trump has set back the globalist agenda and slowed it down, it doesn't affect the Chinese-Russian agenda. And the reason is because they're two independent things. You've got to remember that the globalists cannot start this war, and that's why all of these people on the internet, from Paul Craig Roberts onward, that you read about, you know, if Erdogan goes after Assad, it's going to cause World War III. If such and such happens, it's going to cause World War III. It isn't, because Russia isn't ready. Look, when Turkey shot down one of their fighters, that could have caused World War III, right? No, because Russia isn't ready to take on NATO. That's why they let that plane go down, and they didn't take any retaliatory action. So the point is, the Russians and Chinese have always had, as part of their genetic political DNA, to attack the West. It isn't to destroy the West, and the globalists know that. The Chinese want to attack the U.S. military to decapitate our defense and then blackmail us into submission. They want to control the economy completely of the West. They don't want to destroy it. That's what keeps them alive, right? Now, you know, naive Republicans say, well, that's why China will never attack the West, because they depend on us for their business. But if they decapitate the military and don't strike cities, you see, they've got it both ways. They can stop having the U.S. twist their arm, and they can control us. That's what they're intending. Now, the globalists are going to take advantage of that, because they're building huge underground bunkers. Now, believe me, it isn't just Mount Weather anymore. There's new bunkers being built all over Washington, D.C., Denver, as I mentioned. There's even one out in the west desert of Utah. So these people are planning to survive. And that's one thing I talked about. You're not planning to lose. They're planning on losing at least the beginning of a nuclear war. And they want you undefended. They don't want you to have any nuclear fallout protection. They want you to be in maximum panic. They want you to be sick from radiation sickness, so that when they come out of their bunkers all healthy, and they can say, well, you know, the Russians deceived us. We didn't know this was going to happen. Of course they knew. That's why they were in their bunkers when it happened. But the point is that they'll say, now our only way to defend, now that our United States military has been decapitated, is to join together in a militarized global government. And they'll probably base it around this new EU army or NATO that they're planning on working through now. And that's how we'll get ourselves into a global military government with taxation power, with a new currency. And so all of this talk about financial collapse and the collapse of the dollar before war is just bogus. It's been going on since 2010. They never admit they're wrong. And of course, I can understand why they wouldn't. It is a fiat money system. It is inflated. Look at the stock market, past 19,000. Now remember, if they really wanted to pull the plug on Trump, they'd pull that stock market down and admit they're not. Right now, they're supporting Trump, because right now he's going in the direction they want. He's putting moderates in, and they know they can control those moderates. they'll have to work on him on the illegal immigration. But even if he lets all 30 million illegals stay, they already outvote us. That is, in terms of if we had just our constitutional conservatives voting against all the benefit-corrupted majority and the populace, we'd lose. So I think that they already win, even if we get a border now. It's kind of too late to stop the degradation of our democratic voting powers. So what Trump can do is to stop or slow that down, if he will. But if they assassinate him, of course, you're going to have a firestorm of protest from the Trump supporters. And they know that that's a force to be reckoned with. Had only half of the eligible people voted, had all the apathetic people voted, I think all of the Trump people voted, or at least 99% of them. So if they even got 10% more of the apathetic voters to vote, we'd probably lose. So you see, we're in a real tough situation now. We've got a winning situation right now that's being compromised and co-opted, and we've got to try to hold Trump's feet to the fire. So the best thing you can do, of course, is if you're on that email list to all the Trump campaign, just blast back. We don't want to accept Petraeus or Romney or others. Now, Romney is not going to be as bad as Petraeus as Secretary of State, in my opinion, but he will bring in a lot of CFR globalists. It's just that the only saving grace of Romney is that because he's a good person, if he did see a Benghazi type thing, he wouldn't have authorized the ambassador to be killed. He would have said, send the military in. And that's the difference. And that's why they didn't want Romney in, even though he was trying to please them. They didn't want him in because of that honesty factor. Question in the rear.
Are you convinced me not to trust anybody? You said that Trump has bought us some time. What do I need to be doing to utilize that?
Okay, that's a good point. What do I need to do to utilize that time that he's bought? Well, it has to do with the war scenario, not the economic collapse scenario. That's what's driving a lot of the preparedness movement, is this imminency of economic collapse. But if you ever try to tell your wife or you're a non-believer that economic collapse is coming, you told them in 2010, and now you're totally discredited, you've got to be very careful about repeating stuff like that. But I'm here to tell you that Russia and China are not building massive weapons of mass destruction for peaceful purposes, and they're not just for defensive. And I'm going to guarantee you the U.S. will not strike first. They will continue to wheedle and needle and irritate, etc., until Russia and China finally take down the bully of the world. And that's the reputation that we've been building. So, what I'm saying, you've been given more time, and I think you need to prepare for those times, rather than sit back and say, well, Trump's going to save us. I don't think he will. I think he'll give us more time. If nuclear war is coming, and even though cities won't be hit per se, you got Hill Air Force Base up here that's going to get hit. Why? Because the guidance system, the MX missiles are there, and the missile bodies are out in the West Desert. Those are going to get hit. The Russians don't want those missiles being put back together again. The NSA building in the Lehigh is only worth a couple of cruise missiles, not a nuclear weapon, in my opinion. But I'm hoping and praying it will get hit. What's that?
That's going to spread some real fallout.
If it was a nuclear warhead, if it's a conventional warhead, it won't. But it could. I mean, if the winds are flying from the northwest, Salt Lake and cleared into Utah County is going to get a wave of fallout from Hill Air Force Base and from, if it's a nuclear warhead on a cruise missile, to the NSA spy center there. So what I'm just saying is you just don't want to, it's really easy to prepare against fallout. And that's one of the reasons, people say, well, you just have this point of view because you've written these books on preparedness. Well, I wrote the books because I believed what I was teaching, and I thought that they'd be helpful to other people. But the most important book that you can get, and all of the books that I have are on about a 30% discount here for anybody that's here. This book, for example, How to Build a High-Security Shelter in the Home, is the simplest thing to do. In raw materials, it's only about $3,000, and anybody can afford that, even just by saving money over a couple of years. That's what's important for time. I mean, if you've got a basement, you've already got 2 of the walls built. You can use block and then put a steel and concrete ceiling and all the plans. It's an architectural plan book. But, these things we've helped design and help people install those in their house. And that's the cheapest way to get a fallout shelter. Now, if you're doing new construction, the big book that I've written, my longest standing book, is The Secure Home. This tells, I mean, if you're building an extension on the house or a new garage or an extension on the garage, the best way to do is to put a shelter under that new construction, because that's not part of the original basement. So if anybody's looking for a shelter, they go through your basement, they don't see the hidden doors and the hidden things to the new portion of the basement. And very few people ever expect to see a basement under a garage. And so it's an ideal place to hide that. This book also covers solar generators, food storage, how to get the family ready. I mean, it's the big Bible on how to do total preparedness, but it's got all the architectural details for doing new construction. This book, which is only, instead of $25, it's only $15 here. This is the one that will help most people who are tight on a budget, is how to get a shelter into the existing basement, and there are plans here on how to conceal it as well. So that's what I think you need to use the time to prepare for, is to, I mean, because once weapons start to fly, you'll say, oh yeah, Brother Skousen was right. But what good does it do if you don't have any protection? And you need a radiation meter. You need to know when to come out. There may be waves of fallout. If there's fallout that hits Japan and it takes another week to get here, then you need to know that, oops, radiation's up again. I need to get back into the shelter. And so all these books have complete sources, pages of sources of where to buy these hard-to-find equipment, what the best prices are. And so they're really worth, the little bit of money that you pay. Now, if any of you are sitting ducks near Hill Air Force Base, you need this book, Strategic Relocation. This is all about, it covers Utah. Fortunately, you don't have to leave the state. Utah and Idaho are the two highest rated states in the book. And I rate even nations around the world, etc. Don't be lured into going to Costa Rica or any of these other, expat safe havens. Look, those are built on a tourist economy, and someday when war comes, there's going to be no tourism in Costa Rica. And those people are going to be in debt to their heels, those governments. They're going to be confiscating Americans' bank accounts and American properties. So it's not going to be, don't make decisions based on the current economy. You want to make decisions based upon a worst-case scenario, a war scenario. And I'm here to tell you, though, I don't think the Russians and the Chinese are going to hit cities per se. They're going to hit military targets and communication targets. And it's the fallout from those. You wouldn't need to be away from any target areas by 5 miles. That's where the general circle of destruction is around those. And don't spend money on blast shelters. If you're in a 5-mile blast zone, move. Don't buy the shelter with the big blast doors and other things. I mean, it's just ridiculous when you should spend the money on moving to a safer location. Now, one of the things you also want to think about is being able to grow a garden in the long term. There will be famine the first year after a nuclear. It won't be a nuclear winter. That's an anti-nuclear myth. But there will be famine because there'll be no electricity. I think the Russians and Chinese are going to throw an EMP strike 15 minutes before the physical strike. Don't believe the propaganda about Iran throwing an EMP strike. An EMP strike doesn't take down the military. They're hardened against EMP. They could retaliate. So you see, anyone who, besides it takes 6 nuclear high-altitude weapons to blanket the U.S., not one. So North Korea's out, Iran's out. Only Russia and China can throw a massive EMP strike enough to take down the grid. And that's why they're following up with a physical strike on the U.S. military so they can't retaliate. And of course, as I've talked about before, the U.S. has signed PDD-60. It's that secret presidential decision directive which tells our missile forces not to rely on launch on warning. Hint, hint, you're not going to get the nuclear codes to launch. You're going to have to absorb a nuclear first strike. Now, our military still prepares. They still think they're going to get the codes and launch. When they see those missiles in the air, they're going to launch. It's the same thing to do because then their missiles hit empty silos and ours hit real targets. The one who launches second in a nuclear strike wins. Not so. When the U.S. under Clinton told our forces, and it's still in vogue, it hasn't been repealed. One of the things Trump should do, but he doesn't know about it. Repeal PDD-60 and tell our military prepare to launch on warning at anybody who launches on us. PDD-60 says prepare to absorb a nuclear first strike and retaliate afterwards. And General Butch Neal said, retaliate with what? Yeah, and what about our nuclear submarines? Well, in that same year, Clinton agreed unilaterally to keep 50% of our nuclear submarines in port. as a gesture of goodwill to know that we would be vulnerable, that we have no hostile intentions to the Russians. Well, the globalists who fed that little line to Clinton knew what they were doing. And to this day, 50% of our nuclear submarines are in port at any one time. Kings Bay, Georgia, or Bangor, Washington, and they're sitting ducks. So, and besides, the rest of the missiles out there don't have warheads big enough on our Trident submarines to penetrate hardened targets. So the Russians in their bunkers in Yamato Mountain, as big as the Washington, D.C. area underground, are safe from retaliation. And that's what our U.S. has said. Now, did they plan on just losing the war? Is that why they did this? No. I think they have secret weapon systems that after they allow that first strike to fall to justify getting us into a new world order, they have secret space-based anti-missile systems and other things already in place that they will use to stop any other attacks from occurring while we regroup. Because listen, these people are not dumb. They are not inducing this strike to lose. They're inducing this strike to gin up power to get us into this global new world order, and then they'll defend us, but not until we've already absorbed that nuclear first strike. Someday you'll live to see this happen, and you wish you'd prepared. Now, as I say, I don't build these things. I'm too busy for that. But these books are do-it-yourself books, and they will help you get them. And anybody who gets one of these books tonight gets a free pamphlet on storage and barter items, etc. This is $2 if you don't want to buy anything but this. These are all going to be on the table out to the left-hand side as you exit. My son, Andrew, my engineer who co-authored this book with me, is out there and will help you to get those. Any other questions? Oh, lots of them. Yes, sir.
So this is a little different tack. Going back to what you were saying about the influx of aliens from other countries. I was reading an article a couple of months ago about a large number of Muslims are converting to Christianity, and there's a record of God bringing righteous people to this country. And so how does that play into effect? I mean, obviously we don't want people that are going to come here and make things bad, but the other side of it is if God is trying to hasten his work, what better place to bring those people than here where we can talk to them about the gospel?
Well, in the first place, because there is this evil political agenda, and because by far most never convert to Christianity, and most become, do not integrate well within society, and that's why the high rate there in Europe, for example, is because these young, frustrated males, and they're military age coming in, not families. Why are the majorities of military? Because they're escaping either ISIS tried to draft them into the military, or Assad or any other government they don't want to fight. And they're frustrated young males, and they turn to rape because Western girls are dressed to kill, and they get that attack. But what I'm saying is, we should not support refugee influx into the country. But if the government brings them in anyway, yes, we ought to befriend them and see which ones can, in fact, come to higher light and truth. But because of this claim that the Lord is doing this to hasten the work, frankly, it's just like there are many members of the church that thought, well, the Lord brought down the Soviet Union to get the gospel in there. Actually, that isn't true. Satan allowed the Soviet Union to fake its demise to get Western aid and trade, and the Lord took advantage of that for a period of time, and now the door is closing. Okay? So, it isn't that was the Lord's doing, it was Satan's doing. The Lord piggybacks on this. The refugee movement isn't the Lord's movement, it's Satan's movement. The Lord will harvest a few souls out of it, and that's our job to do that. But we should not promote because of the potential, or we should not promote because the majority are not going to be beneficial to this country coming in.
About a couple of months ago, you were on the Alex Jones show, and Alex Jones seemed somewhat serious about bringing you to Trump Tower for a few hours to explain to Trump in some credible way who the bad guys were. What are the chances of that happening?
Did anyone hear the question? Well, Alex Jones and I have been in discussions about getting me and a couple of other people who understand the conspiracy in front of Trump. And, Alex always claims to be able to, have insider connections through Roger Stone to get to Trump. But he apparently doesn't, because nothing's ever come of that. He's not been able to get us an audience. And I've often wondered, why is it that, there are so many of us out here who are knowledgeable and understanding what's going on. Why doesn't the Lord get us in front to be able to make a change? Doesn't the Lord support what we're doing? And the answer, sadly, is that the nation doesn't deserve to be saved. It's already gone in terms of immorality and and lack of listening to conscience. I mean, we're already past the point, I think, of being worthy of being saved. Yes, the nation could repent. The Lord always holds that Senate, but I just don't see it happening. So the point is, I think what the Lord is preparing to do is to save a remnant. And in order to be saved as a remnant, one, you've got to not compromise your principles. You don't want to become a populist. You want to stay with an ideological pro-Constitution view. You want to be listening to conscience. That's the greatest thing that's going to save you, is listening to the nervous feelings that warn you about bad eating or bad waste of time or wrong decisions or shutting your mouth when you shouldn't say something. Listening to nervous feelings is the biggest violation that failing to listen to nervous feelings is the biggest violations even that members of the church have, even that supposedly have the Holy Ghost. You look at their level of nutrition and weight control. The Mormons are generally the most overweight people in the world. And people who drink and smoke and yet who exercise and are otherwise fit, look down upon them and say, what's this word of wisdom thing? Look at you. Look at me. I don't live the word of wisdom, but I'm tough and strong, they say. They may not say it openly, but they see us as hypocrites because we don't live the higher law of listening. Conscience will tell you, don't take the second helping. Conscience will tell you, discipline your kids. Don't listen to permissiveness. Conscience will tell you not to waste your time, not to watch junk food, not to eat junk food, not to drink pop. I don't care if it's got caffeine in it. Junk food is junk food. And it's not a rule. The God isn't going to make a commandment. That's why you're being tested every day by these little promptings. Don't do that. And promptings, get off your duff and do something. Help your wife do the dishes. Clean up the yard. And you say, I'm too tired. And you give one excuse. You're being tested every day, hundreds of times with those little promptings. And when you start to live those promptings, you'll be part of the remnant because you'll depend on those promptings someday in order to get the message to get out of Dodge or when the strike is coming and when you need to be prepared. Sir.
Will you help us get rid of Senator Hatch?
I don't think I've ever said a kind word in my World Affairs brief about Senator Hatch. I attack him at every opportunity. The problem with Senator Hatch, of course, he is worshipped by the leadership of the church and the members because the leaders like him. They really like anyone who's made a name for themselves who can potentially improve the church relationship. And it's a trap. It's a trap because they even praise Harry Reid. And Harry Reid's going to hell. So is Orrin Hatch. Sir.
What do you think is going to happen if Trump is able to repeal the Johnson Amendment on the muzzle for religious leaders to speak politically? He lives in their 501c3 status, or their tax status.
I think that would be a great thing, to remove the 501c3 restriction on speech, on political speech. In fact, I think, frankly, churches ought not to be 501c3. I believe as Pastor Chuck Baldwin has said that they ought to demand their right as a religious organization to be free from that government control. But I think the first step is to get rid of the Johnson Act there.
What do you think will be the result if they do that? If they're able to do that with churches?
Well, it will free up churches. It will free up churches to speak their mind without losing their tax exemption. Now, that said, I think that most churches have built up a roster of leadership that actually believes that in the benefit of seeking accommodation with the world. So I don't know if it would change that much. It would take probably 10 years, maybe 20 years to get a new crop of really strong religious people who would surge to leadership. But the current crop of leadership in Christianity, as Pastor Baldwin will tell you, is a sellout to the world. Yes, ma'am, or sir.
don't mean to act like I'm pushing back on you because I'm not. But isotopes, other attacks that are going to be with us for, better say, 2,000 years. Starting 90 and ceasing. What are these in dark soil? Will not be able to avoid it in the book. What conditions? Now, okay, we go with all shelters. But spirit, I'm not going to sincere on doing that. For the senators, we have pretty actuators. But what's going to protect our children dying deadly isotopes in a limited nuclear shield. Like the one you're talking about. I'm not trying to be...
No, I understand. It's a legitimate question with NBC training, meaning nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare training. He's talking about the long-living isotopes. They are, however, strontium-90 and cesium, a very, very tiny percentage of what's coming off. Most of it is gamma radiation that comes off nuclear weapons, unlike a nuclear power plant, which is just full of long-term radioisotopes. That's why you don't want to be downwind of a nuclear power plant. That's really deadly. That said, you've got to remember that there was only a very small percentage or uptick of the cancer deaths downwind of Chernobyl as far as of Europe. So it isn't like people are dropping like flies. In fact, most of the people who died from radiation poisoning after Chernobyl were people who were sedentary, overweight, had other problems that were not otherwise healthy. In other words, the human body does have some capability of trying to remediate and repair damaged cells from radiation. Obviously, you don't want to be ingesting, and after a nuclear, you're going to have to be careful to drink filtered water. You're going to want to make sure that you don't eat food, that is taken up or grown in areas that have been downwind. Yeah, and that's the problem. There is a plume that comes down, and you can map the plume and know where the dust is lying from those things. And I wouldn't be growing gardens in any of that area because of the long-term isotopes. But areas outside of the plume, it's okay to buy or grow fruit and vegetables. And that's one of the reasons why I've relocated to another part of rural Utah to make sure I'm completely out of those plumes to avoid that problem. So I just don't want you to feel like there's just no hope because there's going to be some strontium-90. It's not completely deadly in the dosages that are here, if you keep your exposure down. And it is important to have radiation mask, even if you just buy paint-grade filters. I keep one in the trunk of my car, just in case I get trapped out on the freeway and there's an event. I want to be able to strap on a mask. I don't have to put on a full gas mask, but a paint-grade respirator will do 99% of what a gas mask will do for $35. So everybody can afford to keep one. I keep one by my bedside in case there's a fire. You can put one of those masks and walk out of a smoke-filled house without any ill effects for $35. So remember, there's lots of good hints in the books that I've written on how to, prepare and do those things. I don't want to underestimate what you're saying. I don't want people to feel... Yeah, no, I understand, and I do appreciate your remark. It is a danger, and you've got to be careful of those things. But the first line of defense is to have a shelter and to have regular face mask gear, so that if there's any chance of any of this dust still in the air, that you're not breathing it in. And then you only have to worry about what's in the water and in the ground. And as I say, don't eat vegetables out of the downwind plume. Yes, sir.
I've heard that the United States is going to get the blame for starting this on North Korea moving on South Korea and stuff.
Now, that's my theory, is that this war is triggered by North Korea attacking South Korea. And the reason I think it's a good trigger event, not the Middle East, is because, first of all, North Korea is a puppet state of China, and they purposely have always kept an unstable idiot in charge of North Korea. Why? So you see, China doesn't get the blame. It's that idiot, Kim Jong-un, that started the war, and nobody's to the blame. He's just an idiot. You see? It's a perfect ruse to start a war. But in order to stop 2 million men from coming across the border, the U.S. is going to have to use tactical nukes. And then Russia and China get to say, you started it. Not a nuclear war, but you started the first use of nukes, and so therefore they use that. I'm hypothesizing they may use that as an excuse to nuke they will have to do an excuse. They're not going to do it just out of nowhere. They're going to wait until the U.S. has done something that appears over the top, and they'll use that as an excuse to strike. But the Americans won't see it as the Americans' fault. The Russians and Chinese will say, this is either the bully of the world that we've got to stop, or because of use of nuclear weapons in Korea that it started a nuclear war. At least that's my theory.
Then, you followed on that during World War II. Because of the nuclear, because of the dollar. Have these maps changed?
Yes. Yes, they have changed. And nobody knows exactly what the Russians and Chinese have as their target list. But I can tell you they have to take out all strategic air assets, missile bases, and communication hubs. They've got to shut down our ability to communicate with satellites, and so those big long wire antennas up on the northern border of Canada, those are going to be hit. The U.S. used ground wave type things actually transmit through the ground and the ocean to get to submarines as well as satellites. They'll use anti-satellite weapons. I mean, it's going to consume at least 3,000 warheads just to hit the military targets and the communication targets all around the world that the West has involved to neuter our ability to retaliate as far as they think. So I don't think they're going to use weapons to hit cities. They'll threaten to do that later, but I think that's when the U.S. brings out their secret weapon systems to stop that. I can't conceive that they would induce this war without having some backup to keep from being annihilated after a nuclear first strike. Yes, sir.
What do you think will be the greatest challenge in the next 4 years for us? The way of life, the economy, our savings, or, what's going to be the challenge? Hard times, what does that mean?
Well, there may be a stock market crash. I mean, with this stock market looming, but I want to disabuse you of any of this notion on the internet about a collapse of the currency or an economic collapse. Economies never collapse without war. Never. And I say that because I don't consider the collapse of the Soviet Union a true collapse. That was a false, phony collapse. But when you have, like the Russians invading Germany, the economy collapsed because nobody could go to work. They're all running from the Russians. That's when economies collapse. Well, Argentina didn't collapse. Now, they had a complete banking collapse in 2000 in Argentina, okay? And nobody could get anything out of the bank. And guess what came out of the mattresses of Argentina? $50 billion, US dollars, that people have been stashing away. But the economy didn't collapse. The banking system, the people hustled and maneuvered. And that's what happens. As long as you can hustle and maneuver, economies are not going to collapse. Now, forget about the IMF and the SDRs becoming the new world currency. That's a whole bunch of conspiracy theories about that predicted in September 30th when the IMF took on the Chinese yuan as a new SDR, that all of a sudden there were going to be all these SDR bonds and Chinese-backed currency, and it was going to flood the world with currency. People who make those kind of statements just don't understand how big the dollar economy is. I mean, the dollar economy, just in printed dollars alone, is at least 300 trillion. 300 trillion. And that doesn't count 500 to 1,000 trillion in derivative contracts, which aren't even backed by any dollars. That have never been printed. And that's a Ponzi scheme. When you commit to pay an accumulated $500 trillion that don't even exist, there's no insurance requirements as an insurance company. They have to have 20% of their assets for every contract they have. That's kind of a 20% Ponzi scheme. But derivatives have zero requirement for any assets backing. Now, why doesn't that collapse the economy? Because you see, the powers that be control when they decide a collapse or when they decide a default occurs. When Greece defaulted on their bonds, there were all kinds of derivative contracts at risk. And what did they rule? It was not a default. It was just a write-down. So none of the derivative contracts were able to collect. That's how they protect these people who have derivative things. I mean, but it's a real Ponzi scheme. But so I predict there could well be a 20% correction in the stock market. It's crying out for it. It's a balloon. But remember, all of the new money that the Fed is creating goes into the Wall Street bankers first, and that's where they get all this excess money to put into the speculative economy. And about 20% of that drifts into the real economy. That's why there is some inflation going on. Inflation, real inflation is about 7 to 9%, not the 1 to 2% the Office of Budget and Management says. They purposely underplay inflation to keep from having to pay a cost of living allowance for Social Security recipients. They gave us a token $7, a year or something. It doesn't even come close to paying what the inflation rate is in this economy. But remember, you cannot have hyperinflation or the collapse of the dollar without hyperinflation. You can't have hyperinflation without indexing. You know what that means? Every country that was hyperinflated, Germany and Zimbabwe, has had indexing. And then what that means is the government passes a law that everybody has to have their salaries automatically increased to the rate of inflation. How else do you get a wheelbarrow full of $100,000 mark bills? Because the government mandates that everybody keep raising their salary. Now, if you have inflation without indexing, and they raise the prices 20%, and you can't raise your salary, what happens? You buy half as much as what you did, and the economy implodes. It's called stagflation. It's what happened in the 70s. Inflation was rising at almost 15 to 18%. People couldn't keep pace. Stop buying. That's the counter to hyperinflation. You cannot have hyperinflation without indexing to keep people's salaries in pace. And that's why anybody like Peter Schiff, as smart as he is, doesn't seem to get it. You can't predict hyperinflation without indexing. And we don't have that mechanism. When we did, Obama, remember, twice after 2008, gave everybody a $150 billion gift that was spread out. And we had the highest rate of inflation in the United States the 3 months after every one of those injections into the economy. So if they did that regularly, we'd get hyperinflation. But there is no mechanism constitutionally to do that now. So I don't think there's going to be a collapse of the economy. I think interest rates will start to rise a little bit, so we'll get a little bit more in bank interest rates. But the best thing that you can do really is to make sure that you get debt-free real estate, which will rise up with this, and try to get out of debt as you climb. But I don't think there's going to be any actual economic collapse prior to war. And the reason is remember, if the powers that be pulled the plug on the economy by cutting the money supply, there are 100,000 Fed watchers that would know to the very hour the Fed cut the money supply. Who would get the blame? The Fed. And people would be fed up. The Trump people would get out and say, yeah, kill the Fed. But if they wait till war happens, war does cause a collapse of the economy. But the powers that be say, hey, it's the war. It's not us. And it gives them an excuse to have a whole new currency because what? Everything's worthless now. Now remember, as soon as the war starts, the dollar cash will be king, not silver and gold. You try passing a gold coin to somebody and they look at it and say, you say this is worth $2,000? How do I know this is real? How do you prove it to them? You're just not going to be able to. Not until a long time when there's nothing else left and people start to say, yeah, this looks good. And it just takes a long while for silver and gold. I mean, my brother gives off silver dollars as tips in New York. And he's just shocked now because about 75% of the bellboys and helps that he gives tips to don't recognize what it is. What's this? It's a silver dollar. They don't recognize what it is anymore. But still, I think the silver dollar is your best barter coin. If you're going to store barter coins, silver, they're big, fat, and heavy. They look valuable. They're coins. Nobody's going to question the validity of those generally. So I think that's your best barter coin. And it's not worth so much. You can try giving a $2,000 gold coin, for a $100 purchase and try to get change for it. It's not going to happen. Remember, cash will be king at the beginning of the war. They're not going to be printing any more money, so it's just going to get more valuable. So if you see the war clouds coming, that's one of the things in my World Affairs brief. I look forward to telling you how the progress is coming on that. But if you see war coming, cash out and get strong on cash. Now, you can't do that in a high inflationary economy where it's at 10 to 20% because your value is being lost. But just before a war, get cash heavy because that's going to be the most valuable trading commodity. And then it resorts to barter. That's why the barter list in here is really important about how to trade things. I mean, you think about manufacturing a light bulb. It's just not going to happen. manufacturing a grabber screw. I mean, just think of how much money you can get trading grabber screws when they're not available anymore. Those things are great barter items, or 22 ammunition, etc. Question here. Yeah, and it just shows that the people are in abject rebellion. You can't get rid of cash when 50% of your economy isn't even online, doesn't even have a credit card. I mean, they moved too soon on that. And in other areas where they're trying to restrict cash, like other banks in Europe, etc., guess what? Those banks are going under. People are just pulling out. As long as there's an alternative, people are not going to stand for this, cashless society yet. But I think after war, all bets are off. They can justify putting people in camps, rounding up conspiracy believers. They can justify a mark of the beast and do anything with war. People just lay down and say, save us. You think 9/11 was bad about getting people to lay down and not object to government? War, especially nuclear war, is going to be the most powerful motivator for them. Yes, sir.
So what's your best forecast?
Well, first of all, if you see this attack of North Korea on South Korea, I think we'll have nuclear war within a week. And the reason is I don't think the U.S. can stop it without using tactical nuclear weapons. The reason I say what's about North Korea, the reason is there has to be some reason to explain why North Korea has been treated with kid gloves. I mean, look at how they've treated Iran all these years. It doesn't even have a nuclear weapon yet. Has a few missiles that can reach Israel maybe, but not the U.S. And yet North Korea has missiles that can reach our shores, has tested nuclear weapons, has nuclear weapons, and we do nothing. Oh, yes, we just passed new recent sanctions, but we know darn well that China bypasses all those sanctions. North Korea can get everything through China, and we don't sanction China. So you see, our sanctions are paper. But if anybody broke the sanctions, actually they did. China didn't abide by the sanctions with Iran, and we didn't do anything to China. You see, China's the big gorilla in the room, and the U.S. isn't going to do anything to stop or really, cut China from becoming a world power because they want the conflict. They want the nuclear war that China will bring someday. But because that they have bent over backwards to protect North Korea, I mean, we don't even have a military regime change on the table. It's not on the table. No military option, no regime change. Yet we have a regime change and military option on the table for Iran. It doesn't make sense unless you realize the globalists know that North Korea is going to be the trigger event, and they're preserving it. They're making sure that it stays there, and little crazy Kim Jong-un is going to be there to pull the trigger someday. So if you see that attack of remember, North Korea attacks in small ways. North Korea shells an island or something every year. But if you see a major invasion, watch out. You got about a week, if that. Now, as a short-term thing, if all the lights go out, there's an EMP strike, you got maybe 15 minutes to a half an hour before weapons start to fall. But any notice is good notice, because if you're downtown and you've got to beat the traffic and get home, you got to make sure that you know all the signs possible for when war will happen. Yes, sir.
I have to respectfully push back. I've followed your work for years, read all your books. In fact, Strategic Relocation caused me to move from New York City to here. I was actually in contact with you prior a few years ago via email. 9/11 things you mentioned earlier, that all the firemen, just like Giuliani knew in advance. I'm a retired New York City fireman who was there on that day. Pardon my emotions. This is the first time, unless you know more New York City firemen than me, I've never heard one person say they dislike Giuliani. He visited me in the hospital twice. I've never heard anyone speculate this theory. New York City firemen I'm talking about. And do you have any scholarly piece of literature or anything you could point me to say that he had advanced knowledge?
So this is a person from New York who moved here because of strategic relocation, but he's questioning my claim that the New York City firemen dislike Giuliani. He is a former New York City fireman, and Giuliani visited him in the hospital. He does not like Giuliani. He's just asking for evidence. Well, if you do a certain amount of Google searching about, and there's videos of New York firemen talking about how much they dislike Giuliani because of the Building 7.
Two quacks on the internet. You can find anything on YouTube. I mean, you said plural. Is it like two guys?
No. No, I've seen a lot of videos from the New York City firemen. Apparently you have not.
I have not.
But they're out there. But remember this. There is the New York fire marshal who was in contact with Giuliani or in his emergency headquarters and got a call to go up there and saw other firemen warning him off from going into the building, said the building's going to be pulled. And he went in there and got up and saw there were hot coffee cups and everything. They had been recently evacuated, the emergency center where he had been called to go visit where Giuliani was. And he realized, and he started to hear cracking within the building, and I'm sorry, not cracking, but explosions going off in the building. And he's got a whole testimony of that. And he starts going down the stairway, and a big explosion comes off. These are explosions going on, not the building collapsing, actual explosions. And he makes it out of the building, and then this building comes down. But he's a living witness of testimony that Giuliani was in the building, obviously evacuated with everybody, that people knew that it was going to be pulled, and that's a code name for being by explosives, and it clearly did come down with explosives. I mean, Giuliani's got to know that.
I don't want to sidetrack the whole audience. I would dispute much of what you're saying. The gentleman you're referring to, he headed downtown to with was Thomas von Essen, the fire commissioner. And one person would go in the building knowing they're about to come in the street afterwards next to my friend Pete Yancey, Battalion Chief Pete Yancey. You could look it up. He was decapitated very quickly when stuff started to fall. He was right near Pete Yancey when that died. He knew, yet he put himself that close to death. I don't buy it. And pull it, if that's on audio somewhere, it could refer to anything. Pull the guys, pull the guys.
Well, you know, you can say objecting to the pull it doesn't mean pull it, but it does mean it. And the point is, the video of it shows it clearly as a controlled demolition. Now, there's no question about that. I'm not going to argue with you about that. And there's 1,500 architects and engineers that certify that the NIS lied when they said that this came down because of damage to one corner, of a small fire.
You got the last point I'd like to make. I've been in collapses. I was there that day. Buildings make very strange noises when they're about to go down. The larger they are, the different construction, the more noises, different noises they make. And trust me, they sound like explosions at that time.
Well, other people, experts and firefighters disagree. They say these were explosions going on, and it's different from creaking and breaking of beams and things, from stress and going on. Explosions are explosions, and they show up seismically as well. But anyway, that's enough on this. Yes, sir.
I'm a scoutmaster and a young father. What resources or advice would you give to help teach their lives may be drastically different? So what types of careers would I recommend? What types of education systems?
All right, that's a very important question. What do I do to help save the youth? Remember, the reason the millennials voted almost en masse against Donald Trump is because they're products of the public schools. They get indoctrinated completely about pro-government socialism almost constantly, as well as, and it's the worst thing is you can overcome the bad education in public schools, but you can't overcome the wave of bad attitudes that infest the public schools that you get infected with when you live among those bad attitudes, the snide, kiping, and the cutting remarks, and the badgering and the bullying and the other things. And what I'm just saying is that, first of all, if you want to save the youth, you've got to get them out of public schools. That's just the frank thing. They've got to be either homeschooled or in private schools. You've got to keep them from having vaccines and all of the autism and the other things that are involved in vaccines. But it is the atmosphere of just going along. It's the peer pressure. We homeschooled all 6 of our children, and they become very, very successful people. And uniformly, what people would say to us is, what about the social experience they're missing? And we would say, it's because of the social experience we don't want them in public schools. In fact, our children were not retarded. In fact, they developed, in terms of sexual orientation, later than normal because they weren't bombarded with all this sexual-oriented talk all the time. So they developed and maturated later, which was beneficial to them, as well as they were always dealing with mostly with adults rather than kids, and so their vocabulary and their attitudes grew up better in that regard. But none of them had trouble getting married and finding very fine people, though when you are a higher class, well-educated, stable individual, there are less to choose from because they're not attracted to the typical public school, boy or girl. But it turned out very successful. But if you're going to influence youth, if you're in Scouts, for example, the Scouts have been full of permissiveness now, permissive discipline, and you just got to not do that. You've got to teach them toughness, a little bit of military training and drill and discipline and controlling and going to sleep on time when you're on campouts, requiring that type of thing, teaching them to listen to conscience. When you teach them acting up, say, wait a minute, didn't you feel nervous about that? Because you violated those nervous feelings, I'm disciplining you, not just because you did something wrong. Listen to those feelings. If you discipline that way, the kids will start to say, okay, you're going to get after me if I disregard those feelings. And when they're just sitting around and complaining, I don't have anything to do, check your mind. Don't you feel prompted to do something? Oh, yeah, I don't want to do that. Well, that's a rule we'll make. Always force yourself to do the things you know you should do, especially when you don't feel like it. You teach kids to do that and to not violate nervous feelings, and you'll be amazed at how they can become resistant to peer pressure even if they stay in public schools. Conscience is the real big key towards our own salvation and listening to the daily promptings that we get as well as our children. So that's what I would say for kids. Yes, sir.
So lately I've been really concerned about all the false flags that are going on and resulting loss of liberties and how to help people recognize the symptoms of. And I saw a documentary on
Right.
And they said this was a school, it was decommissioned, no one had been there, the boilers didn't work. And then when you zoom down on the photos, the kids walking hand in hand, they saw parents there, all of them with name tags on, straps of water bottles, and said this was just a drill. We need to get out to be different.
Well, Sandy Hook was real in the sense that children did die, but there was so much that was falsified about it that it's very easy to make the case. I'm really objecting to it didn't happen in crisis actors, like in the Boston Marathon. I mean, I'll tell you, to say that the guy in the wheelchair who, can talk to today, there's interviews with him, missing his leg, that was all fake, it's unnecessary. And what it does, these are false conspiracies about conspiracies to get real conspiracies discredited. Now, like in Sandy Hook, one of the little girl in the red dress actually did die. Dr. Pooley here sitting was in the same ward as this family. The girl is gone, not a crisis actor. Now, this is the Mormon that gets up on television and he forgives everyone and he seems like he's acting. But in fact, that's part of the Mormon theology, is looking past it and forgiving. And that's why he says that, not because he's an actor. But it was really real. Now, what wasn't real, for example, is that he used a handgun, and he wasn't the only shooter. There's the witness of the boy coming out, interviewed by the newspaper reporter, and said there's another guy in there that they have on the floor with handcuffs. Well, you don't put the dead guy in handcuffs. So there was another guy. Now, in every one of these false flag shooters, we use a hypnotized or mind-controlled individual like Adam Lanza. You have a handler in there who's got a gun, who's going to, if he doesn't commit suicide according to his promptings, then they execute him. But he didn't use an AR-15. There was no rifle inside there. An AR-15 through little children is going to go right through those bodies. It doesn't stop. And so they had a coroner who falsified that they were all AR-15 wounds. It had to be a handgun that was used, that would stop those bullets. So, they switched it to an assault weapon so that they could get the assault weapon banned, but that's the issues of it. But yes, people really died. It was a real school. And so be very careful of the crisis actor. Now, that said, there was a crisis actor in it, but it wasn't that the whole thing was falsified. One of the parents turned out to be one of the SWAT team people that was also shown in the picture in the same thing, and then he turned out to be one of the parents. And so this turned out to be, one who would create emotional drama for the video, who was a crisis actor. But it doesn't mean that the whole thing was staged. They do use crisis actors sometimes to promote certain aspects of it. But the Batman shooter in Colorado, for example, that was a real shooting, but he was mind controlled. And the proof of that was that as soon as he came in the courtroom, he was just dozing off. And the first thing that the judge said was, authorize this guy to be on his mind meds or his medical things. And he was under the care of a psychiatrist. And they often use CIA-controlled psychiatrists in order to to do the hypnosis. And I think they use hypnosis a lot. Hypnosis is something where Satan does take possession, partial possession of the brain. I remember as a child when I was in public school and the teacher was teaching us about hypnosis, and I felt this very nervous feeling, don't do this. Because I would see them, release your mind, just release. And I just felt this is not right, to release control of your mind. And when you do that, that's why people with these near-death experiences have them enhanced with hypnosis, because they let themselves go. They actually get revelation inside. They have a memory planted in there that now they think is real. So Satan can be very, very real. And there's a lot of key signs that dreams and visions and near-death experiences are not all from the Lord, if any. I treat them all very, very skeptically. Just because someone has a near-death experience doesn't mean it's from the Lord. One of the most telltale signs of the falsehood that Satan is planting information is always, every one of these near-death experiences have this unconditional love of the Savior. No matter what kind of person they were, there's this all-embracing love of the Savior, and it promotes this concept. Doesn't matter what you are, you're all going to get the same acceptance from the Savior. That's a satanic doctrine. I can tell you that Fidel Castro isn't getting the embrace of the Savior as he went back. He even said in an interview, I'm going to hell. Absolutely correct.
Joel, let's
Yes.
take one more question.
Okay.
About that. And then afterwards, if you want to do more questions at the table, that's great.
Okay, thank you. Sir.
All right, for you.
All right, we'll take both of your questions.
Okay, 2 more questions.
Yeah.
I'm 49, and I am one of the leading edges of Generation X. And we've known for several years that Social Security is not going to be around. Pushing off nonprofits since you can pay your taxes.
Yeah, who's going to worry about Social Security?
Plus, Obama's for the idea that no one has the right to retirement because that's the advantage of someone else and that's a lot of it. Question though, for right now, what about things like 401ks versus IRAs, or current use for any usage, near-term usage? Should we keep them, put it all, take it out, not have the contributions at all, just use it as a food source? What is your take on that?
I suppose you all heard the question about 401ks and your own personal retirement funds. So we have a little more time. So at some point, here's the scenario I think is going to happen. The government's going to use the next massive stock market crash. Even 20%, most of the pension funds are going to be wiped out. Okay? And what's everybody going to cry for relief for? Government, save our pension funds. And the government's going to say, yes, we can save them, but we're going to have one big national pension, and you're all going to have to put your 401ks and everything into it. So you want your money out before that happens. And because the stock market's gone to 19,000, and if they don't like what Trump's doing, and they can pull that down because he certainly can't do all of what he's going to do in terms of saving American great if they pull a stock market crash on him. So I'm recommending that people take the penalty, pull out of the 401ks, and start to put it into, paying off debts, paying down your home mortgage, and then getting prepared. And I really think you'll thank me for it eventually. You can play the game of taking it a few more years, but once you have that crash, once your 401ks are going to be worth a lot less. So right now, while they're high, that's why I'm saying now's the time to cash out. And the other question is.
2 days ago, I was listening to a program of Michael. This was Michael Spicer talking about Alex Jones. And he's talking that he developed this theory that Alex had a relation with Jews, and because his wife was a Jew, basically what he was saying, he was a Jew as well. And just seeing that, the way that Alex is going right now on his brain, he's looking more like a CNN and MSNBC with all this gossip rather than real news. He's just going on the drop on everything. And just today, I read an article of Chuck Baldwin. All the people that Trump is getting into his positions. And many of them are globalists, either Rothschilds or Goldman Sachs, TFRs, and we can see that the trend that is moving. We can see that Alex is just bringing more gossip. Not completely, but just you can see that it's not like a few years before when he was talking more about the Chiefs and so many other subjects. But today is just about Trump every day and Trump every day. What do you think of that?
Well, I know Alex personally. I don't think he's COINTELPRO. I don't think he's fronting for the Jews. He happens to agree with me that all of the bad Jews are globalists. And so if you attack globalists, you get the bad Jews. You don't have to crucify yourself by going on a rampage about the Jews, because then you get branded as anti-Semite. But if you attack globalism, you attack all the bad Jews that are part of the globalist thing. And that's what he agrees with, and that's why he doesn't. And I know Piper has been crucifying and claiming this about Jones for years, but look, there's other ways to explain what Alex is. First of all, Alex is a hypester. I mean, every hype sells, and he's got millions of subscribers that prove that. I've tried to get Alex to tone it down and to be more credible, and he says, look, this sells, this is what I am, I can't help it. And I don't think he can any more than Trump can help what he is. But I think you can explain what Alex does by the fact that you'll notice when I'm on Alex Jones, he changes tone. I mean, he doesn't counter what I say, and he doesn't engage in hype, and I downplay the hype. I try to do it without embarrassing him too much, because he is very sensitive. But I think Alex is sincere. I just think he's got a very hyped up personality and doesn't have a lot of verbal control and emotional control. And that's why he goes on these rants. But I can assure you from my own personal, and I'm a pretty good judge of character, that even though we're not, even though I have this criticism of Alex, I think he's sincere in his desire to see the Republic. In fact, I know that from having been with him personally and without the hype and without the cameras. And I'm not easily fooled. Anyway, that's my feeling. Okay, it's been a pleasure to be with you, and I know we could talk all night. It's an interesting subject, but I'll be happy to field a few more questions out by my book table. Anyway, thank you very much.
Mr. Joel, round of applause.